all the training activity they are performing, to make the institution able to manage what is coming, and sort of to be leading on that. So this, we think, is important, the Mission 300, because it's fitting exactly in this context that we wish to guide. And what ARENA can do more on that. You know that following the Africa Summit in Nairobi in September 2023, we have launched the Accelerated Partnership for Africa. That is working well. We have, under the leadership of Germany, Denmark, the UAE and the US, and the leadership of 11 countries that today are part of APRA, and we will be 15 before the summer. I think this could be try to connect with the compact exercise, because we have seen in our investing forum in Nairobi how this is working well. Now we have pipeline of projects. We are trying to make this project to be bankable. So there is a kind of a good line of work. And we also put in this our ETAF, our financial platform that has now 14 partners, including Africa 50, including the World Bank, including with the IFC and MIGA. I think this could be another instrument. So please present project to ARENA. We will try to work with you to assess, prepare the document for the bankability, assess the bankability, and going forward. And just to say, in closing, how good has been the APRA initiative, that we are trying to showcase that. So we have launched with, in Azerbaijan, in Baku, an initiative, similar initiative for Central Asia. We will launch it at the end of this year, another initiative for Southeast Asia, but trying to remain to Africa. So, first, infrastructure, crucial role of the multilateral financial institutions, and all are we ready to work together for making this initiative to be a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think we are coming to the end of the panel session, but I'll still ask just one generic question for all of you, and in particular for Victoria and Joseph and maybe Kamugisha, because we are partners in the Mission 300. So if you look at your crystal ball and envision this Africa Continental Power Master Plan has been developed, fully developed, and throughout the NEPAD and other partners, we have been able to build this infrastructure that facilitates this market trade. What is your vision, especially with regard to Mission 300? Let's start with you, Joseph, then Victoria, and then we'll come to you. 1 minute each, please.
Thank you, Kevin, and it's a very interesting question. I will answer it by quoting the Minister of Power from Nigeria, who in a panel somewhere in Barcelona said, if Kenya's peak demand is 4 hours ahead of Nigeria, and we each have 4 hours of peak demand, why are we both building peaking plants? Why can't we leverage each other's infrastructure to finance, to actually use the power more efficiently? That can only happen if you have a continental master plan and you have the infrastructure such that the peaking plants in Nairobi are available when Nigeria needs them. So my vision is we have the infrastructure, physical, in existence, and I'm delighted that we're now moving towards private sector investment in this infrastructure, but also the trading mechanism to optimize for every country's needs so that we get the cheapest electron, we maximize the capital asset utilization towards a more competitive electricity market. Our continent will only develop if we have affordable power, and this is one key part of that.
Thank you. Victoria?
Thank you. Look, I mean, first of all, if it's been achieved, that's super exciting, and it makes everything much easier. What I would like to see is essentially a point that the minister from Nigeria raised this morning, that he's trading and not getting paid. You know, so how do we make sure that there are good rules of the game that encourage countries to trade? And nobody's saying, well, I can't get paid if I put my power out and I give it. And you have a situation where Sometimes countries can be exporters. Sometimes they can be importers, depending on what their countries are going through, climate factors and so on. And so everybody benefits. And together we're pulling the continent forward, we're providing the access to individual households, and we're also powering our economies to pull this continent out of poverty and into prosperity.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I think Amin, very quickly, and finally Kazaura.
Thank you very much, VP Kevin. For ODANEPAT, first I would like to reemphasize that we consider M300 as a step toward the achievement of the objectives of the CMP AFSEM, multiply by 5 our power generation capacity and ensure universal access by 2040, while complying with our commitment toward just and equitable transition. That's number one. Number two, of course, as an organization, we are going to continue to contribute to it by making sure that our member states have really the capacity, and that's the reason why, and it was reminded by the DG of IRNA, why we are also investing very much into early project preparation, because early project preparation is the best tool, instrument to make sure that we de-risk projects so that we can actually really go toward that. And then thirdly, our vision, of course, is to make sure that those who can produce the cheapest and in a stable manner would actually contribute to give access to those who cannot produce. That's the reason why we are promoting AFSEM. So all in all, for us, M300 is a step, and a strong, solid step toward the realization of CMP AFSEM by 2040. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazaura, but also address Agenda 63, how this mission 300 fits into your Agenda 63, and we'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I can think two quick things. One, what we envisage in 2040, once the AFSEM, CMP, the M300, and all the other continental initiatives are in place, that first thing, that we'll have electricity tariffs which are affordable throughout the continent, not the mismatch of tariffs we have, if you go to south, north, east, or west of the continent or central. The second aspect is we will have increased generation of renewables in our energy mix, and further, the continent further continues to be the lowest contributor to greenhouse gases emission in the world. So these are the two aspects which I can quickly envisage to see will happen in the next 15 years once we have AFSEM, CMP, M300, and all the other initiatives we have fully operational. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you'll all agree that we've had a very invigorating and insightful panel. Please join me in giving them a very hearty round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's do the exact same for Dr. Kevin Kariuki for an excellent job of moderating. Thank you very much, sir. Might I invite all of you for a photo opportunity, if I can invite you just to step forward, and the official photographers to please come and facilitate the photo opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention while that photo opportunity is underway, to explain the final part of our program for this afternoon. We are now going to transition into a short series of really brisk and really concise conversations. We're going to be calling up onto the stage the moderator and their panelists, in most instances 2 or 3 panelists at the very most. And the view here is to really shine the spotlight on some of the challenges and opportunities in the sector. Before I call up our first of these sessions, let's please give our panel a final round of applause as they descend stage. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Madam, thank you very much. Standing by now, ladies and gentlemen, to speak to the question of off-grid and the productive use of energy, it's my pleasure to invite in the role of moderator Manoj Sinha, the co-founder and CEO of HUSC Power Systems. And as Manoj comes up, thank you Manoj, please let me also call on Clement Callis, the CEO of Signum Capital, as well as Matthias Charles Yabe, the CEO of AcoFresh. Let's give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, please. Thank you very much.
Just so you know, I'm taking my CEO place, William Brent. Just so you know.
And you're taking this? Oh, William Brent. Okay. Just a quick, a small deviation. William Brandt is standing in for his CEO, Manoj Sinha, and will therefore take on the role of moderating this session. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, inviting you to lean in to engage. These sessions are going to be fast-paced and short, and so we're looking forward to your attention and your participation. Over to you, William.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. As mentioned, this is going to hopefully be a fast-paced discussion. I am not going to stand at the podium, but sit here with the other panelists. We have an interesting mix of people here. We have a very early-stage company working in Ghana and looking to expand into additional countries in Africa doing cold storage and e-mobility. AcoFresh, and we also have one of the leading debt providers in our space, Signum Capital, Clemens Kalice, as mentioned, and I'm William Brent, the Chief Marketing Officer at HUSC Power. We're a growth stage mini-grid developer, so it's a little bit of an interesting combination on both on the practitioner side, but also on the finance side. So I think I'd like to kick off this conversation. You know, there's been a lot of discussion around productive use, so-called productive use, but I think that it's a very amorphous term that people often interpret in very different ways. So thought I'd begin by asking Matthias and Clemens, you know, sort of how you define productive use. What is productive use to you?
Hi. So for me, I think productive use of energy has to do with making use of different energy sources to ensure that it creates economic value, in that it's able to help create job opportunities and then improve livelihoods of people.
Comments?
Okay, so I struggle with this term as much as probably many of you, and in some way as a provider of capital, to me that term doesn't really capture what the essence is of what we're trying to do. I mean, ultimately, we're in the business of supporting new companies in developing and implementing new business models, and as providers of credit, i.e. lenders, we need to make sure that the money comes back to our investors with a certain return. Now, ultimately, in the broader DRE space that we're looking at, what we're looking for is businesses that deliver ultimately green electrons and use those for different purposes, some of which maybe what traditionally is defined as productive use, which could be solar pumps and other machinery. But in the end, what we are looking for is business models that can catalyze the use of electricity, and we're not so much hung up about whether it's called productive use or not. We want to see businesses that grow, and with that growth, the electricity consumption will ultimately go up, which is what drives businesses, their performance, their profitability, and ultimately allows us to earn a return.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, as a mini-grid developer, everything we do is we would consider productive use, right? We are electrifying communities. We're doing appliance sales and credit financing to allow for both households and commercial users to actually take advantage of the electricity for productive purposes, but we wouldn't call it productive use. It's just part of our business. It's a utility business model with services added on that allow for greater economic activity, job creation, business creation. So, you know, for us, when that term became more current in the discussion, you know, we looked at it and said, well, this is what we've been doing for 16 years. So it's a little bit of a difficult concept for a mini-grid developer to get their head around, just because it's built into what we do from the very beginning. So we're a utility. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe to put this in context of how, as a financier, we approach this. I mean, Matthias, William and I sat down beforehand and discussed a little bit about this very topic, and I was trying to learn about Matthias's business. He's a social enterprise that provides cold storage for farmers in rural locations that don't have access to cold storage, right? So clearly that's a productive use conversation, but my questions to him revolve around other topics. So I go and ask him, okay, Matthias, how long have you been in business, and how are you growing your business? What is it that's required to roll out your solution? So Matthias, maybe you can repeat a little bit what you do and what it takes to scale this business.
Right. So at AkuFresh, we are a social enterprise, youth-led, that is based in Ghana. And then our goal is to ensure that we are providing renewable energy solutions to help smallholder farmers improve their livelihoods and also ensure post-harvest management. And because currently about a third of all food produced every year is lost, and just in Africa, 40% of food produced do not get to consumers. And these are as a result of lack of technology and even energy at this local level. So by offering solar-powered cold storage preservation units, we are ensuring that farmers extend shelf life of crops from 5 days to 21 days. And we are doing this at the farm gate. So we offer a decentralized solar-powered storage unit, which will help smallholder farmers to store the crops at the farm gate, helping them extend the shelf life and look for market. That is the business model. Around it is the fact that we offer this as a service using the pay-as-you-go model, where farmers get to pay 30 cents for each 20 kg crate worth of fresh produce.
So Matthias, you mentioned that you've already pivoted your business model, from more of a services-oriented model to one that's more about build, own, and transfer to local farmer collectives that actually, pay for and then operate the asset. Why? Why did you make that pivot? What forced you to make that pivot? What were the decisions that were behind that pivot?
Right, that's a very good question. So, as a very early stage social enterprise, one challenge we faced, with even regards to speaking to investors, is that they do not really see economic growth because it costs a lot to set up our products. And offering this solution to farmers at 30 cents for 20 kg a day would not necessarily give enough revenue to be able to help scale quickly. So we realized that model would not necessarily help us. But then by pivoting in a sense that we are now becoming technology providers and also empower the local communities to be able to take up the initiative and then run it as community owned, it was something that would look much more sustainable compared to we building it ourselves and then renting it out to farmers. So we are now looking at models where we collaborate with development partners, private organizations, and banks who will now finance the product. So they buy the product from our end, we manage it for 1 year, and then train local community members to take ownership of it. And also looking at farmer cooperatives who will be able to also make an initial deposit of the to own the storage unit, and then have a payment plan with support from local banks and other institutions to be able to help them manage it. With this, it is us that kind of burden of now going to look for money to set up the units and then scale. So, thank you.
So I'm going to jump in here because I think here we get to the real challenge of what we're all trying to address. I mean, clearly, providing cold storage, it has to be a good thing. Overall, there's no debate about it. We manage both credit funds that can lend to a business like this, and we're also a manager of a venture fund that supports early stage businesses. So I turn around to Matthias and say, okay, we have a fund that can give you $5 million in loans to scale up your business, but in order to do that, we require a certain amount of equity, i.e. owner's capital in the deal. So I go to him and say, you come up with $2 million of equity, and then we can have a discussion about $5 million of debt. And then Matthias turns to me and says, this is great, but I mean, getting equity is really difficult, and we've started talking to a number of venture capital funds out there. Yeah. So then I change my hat, take off my credit hat, and put on my venture hat, and I said to him, okay, Matthias, so I'm and I'm on the investment committee of our venture fund, the first question I ask when I get presented a deal is how quickly can you grow, and what kind of multiple on my investment am I going to get? And I say to him, by the way, in this current environment, my fellow IC members are very wary of very asset-intensive business models that need, in addition to venture equity, need a whole bunch of credit. So then I turn back to Matthias and ask him what he's going to do. But maybe rather than ask him and put him on the spot, I'm going to turn to William, because he's gone through this process, and maybe he can give a little bit of better insights into how this process of starting a venture takes you on a road to ultimately having a functioning and profitable business, I hope.
So, well, let me ask you first. I mean, you, I believe, have a development mandate within your fund, correct, in Signum?
Mm-hmm.
So who defined for you, or did you find for yourself, this focus on asset-light versus asset-heavy business models? Because mini-grids are also an asset-heavy business. We struggle to raise equity and debt just like you do, Matthias. But I'm curious, if you don't mind, like, what is the development finance community, what's their thesis, and how did that come about? Is it the LPs who are driving that? Is it you that's driving that? Where does that point of view come from?
That's an excellent question, actually, because the investors in our venture fund are development finance institutions that would all subscribe to the developmental outcomes and the necessities of a business like Matthias's or mini-grids. At the same time, the venture model follows a very specific trajectory of generating returns for its investors. It relies on sort of relatively rapid growth. It also requires most companies to be able to transact outside of their home market, which typically is too small to gain, to allow them to gain the size that they can ultimately exit at the valuations that's required for a typical venture-funded model. I think of it as a first-stage investment, a seed investment followed by 2 or 3 rounds of capital. At each stage, the venture capital universe requires the valuation to go up by a factor of, name it, 3 to 5 times. So you quickly see that for a company to be successful, a venture investor needs to see being able to have a valuation of $100 million. I'm picking some relatively random numbers in orders of magnitude. Then I can look at, and so that's not necessarily imposed on us by the development community that funds us. It's the way the market works, because even development finance institutions want their money back, and in the venture world, that's the way to an exit.
Well, we could have a longer conversation about the development finance community and whether they're headed in the right direction, but we'll leave that aside for now. To answer your question, mini-grids, I think most mini-grid companies start in our industry by thinking just about supply, and thinking that if you can generate and sell electrons, that you'll be able to cover your costs and make a profit. In rural communities, peri-urban communities where there's relatively little economic activity, that's a non-starter. We learned that the hard way. We almost failed as a company. And what we came to realize was that unless you focus both on supply and demand, that you can't come to a profitable business model. And demand for me is essentially productive use, right? Whether it's household or business, if you can create that demand and actually allow for those communities to be productive, then you've solved a big part of your problem, is making sure that you're sweating that asset and using the electricity generation asset to its fullest as much as possible. So that was a really seminal moment for us in terms of realizing, okay, if you're going to do this, you have to look at both the generation side and the demand side, and make sure that those two things are very much aligned.
Yeah, and maybe to pick up on what you said about the sort of the broader financial community, I guess the shortcomings that we are responsible for is that in order to balance supply and demands, there are enough factors outside of everybody's control. We need to be able to provide some visibility on where the financing can come from. And that is difficult, and we haven't done a good enough job, and I'm sure critical to yours and your success.
Matthias, we've talked about raising equity as being one challenge for you. what are the other major challenges that you face as a young startup?
Right. So some of the challenges have to be working with grassroots, people at the grassroots level, because sometimes it's a challenge for people at the grassroots to be able to adapt to modern technology. So you have to usually spend more time trying to educate and create awareness, and also get people to buy into the idea, because you wouldn't want to develop a solution that will end up not being used. Of course, they face a problem, but then if you do not really offer that kind of awareness, it becomes difficult for them to accept the product. So that is usually a challenge that we face, because people usually at that level tend not to adapt easily to modern technology. So that is one challenge. And another challenge has to do with sourcing equipment, because it's usually expensive. I mean, as a mini-grid company, you understand that it's really huge investment, especially investing in renewable energy. So that high upfront cost, and even sourcing the materials, and the materials not being available locally in that quantity is also a challenge. So we end up spending time looking for the equipment we need to put together our technology. That also becomes a challenge in terms of scaling.
But I want to ask you. So what's the thing preventing you, or presenting a challenge to you to invest more capital in this space? Because it's been identified as a market opportunity worth tens of billions of dollars, right? So that's a huge opportunity. Why not invest more?
So I was just about to ask you. Yeah. So we hear of all these challenges, and based on Husk, how long did it take you to get on top of these challenges and get to the stage where this business was per se on a stable ground?
Well, I think so the current version of the company is about 10 years old. It's taken us about 8 years to get there.
Okay, so that's part of your answer, right? We're looking at a lot of businesses like Matthias's, and we know that on average, in this ecosystem that we work in, companies take 8 to 10 years to reach profitability. So he tells me it's going to take him 3 years. Yeah, I add a little bit of fat to it, because I know nothing ever works out the way it does. So I'm already having to plan for a business that needs to access capital for the next 5 to 8 years. This is going to be through I don't know how many macro cycles in which investors come and go. Yeah, so that is my problem. I have not enough visibility on the future to know that if I put money in now, someone's going to come and follow in 3 years' time to take the business to the next level.
Yeah.
And I would like to hear your solution to that.
Yeah, no. So I mean, one of the things I was going to say, even for a growth stage company like us, we deploy our capital to build assets so that we can electrify people. If we're going to add any additional value-added services like productive use into what we do, we still need grant capital to de-risk those business models. And I would say, and Matthias, you disagree with me if you like, I haven't seen a whole lot of productive use business models that have scaled commercially. And, maybe e-mobility, maybe irrigation. But, we've tried cold storage, we've tried rice milling, we've tried e-mobility, we've tried many different things, but we still don't know ourselves what's scalable and commercially viable. So anyway, I think I'm being asked to wrap up, so I want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time. So we're here for Mission 300, right? This big initiative, productive use is part of it. I'd like to ask you both what you'd like to see from Mission 300 to help your business or investments perform the way that you'd like them to.
Yes, let me start, and then Matthias can give the final touch to it. I think there are two themes that I think are very critical and fit very well into this whole event. Yeah, one is time. Yeah, we spend too much time deliberating over how we do things, and not enough time trying to get to solutions. So we need to shorten that 10 years to a much smaller time horizon. And the other thing is we need to grow markets. And we need to grow markets by allowing businesses like Matthias to expand, whether it's from Ghana to Nigeria or across the continent, in a much more seamless way, so that the addressable market gets bigger, the opportunity gets bigger, and capital is more excited about where the journey could end.
Right. For me, I think Mission 300 should also prioritize collaborating with younger organizations, because usually what we usually see is most of these initiatives work with really large organizations, and it doesn't really give younger organizations that kind of experience as well. So when we go to investors like Clems, they always want to say, okay, what previous experience do you have, or how does your book look like? We do not really need very large capital, but at least if we are also plugged into a certain portion of implementing certain projects, it gives us that experience and that credibility to be able to reach out to more people for them to understand that what we are doing actually works to some extent, and then they're able to sort of give us that support. So plugging in younger organizations in this initiative is something that I think it should be a great game changer, so that investors like Clems will be able to support.
Okay, listen up, Mission 300. Matthias needs your support, so let's figure that out. Thank you both for an excellent conversation. Quick, short and sweet, as they say. Thanks so much.
Right.
Yeah, right on time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Un grand merci à nos panélistes et notre modérateur pour la qualité de leurs interventions. Distingués invités, mesdames et messieurs, nous l'avons dit, nous enchaînons aujourd'hui les sessions, les panels. Nous avons beaucoup à dire cet après-midi. Nous poursuivons avec un panel essentiel intitulé « Mobiliser la société civile pour électrifier l'Afrique ». Ce panel mettra en lumière le rôle central des organisations de la société civile dans l'accélération de l'accès à l'énergie sur le continent africain. Alors, pour modérer cette discussion, j'ai le plaisir d'appeler sur scène Semke Kilonzo, qui est directeur exécutif du Policy Forum en Tanzanie. C'est un leader reconnu pour son engagement en faveur de politiques inclusives et participatives. Il sera accompagné de deux intervenants de haut niveau, Sheila Aparaocha, directrice d'Energia, une organisation qui œuvre pour l'intégration du genre dans les politiques et projets énergétiques, et Hadiza Abdul Moumini, point focal mondial de la constituante jeunesse pour l'ODD 7. Alors, mesdames et messieurs, veuillez accueillir chaleureusement notre modérateur et nos panélistes. A warm welcome, please, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for our panel.
How do you operate this? Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Semkai Kilonzo. I am from the Policy Forum, which is a network of civil society organizations working on governance and accountability here in Tanzania. We've got our network has about over 80 organizations brought together in their interest on issues around poverty reduction, equity, and democratization. So that's things around engaging civil society to energize Africa, which is our topic for this panel, is one of the key things that help reduce poverty reduction. So just really quickly to introduce the topic, we know Africa, and we've heard this morning and through the course of today, that Africa faces significant challenges in ensuring universal access to sustainable energy, and civil society organizations have emerged as critical agents, and they have a key role to play as agents of change in terms of contributing to policy advocacy, issues around their work with community-based solutions. Most of the times we've seen very good examples of innovative work being done, and their efforts to make energy access more inclusive. And last but not least, obviously, a huge role that they play in bringing government to account, duty bearers to account for the promises that they make. So without further ado, I'd like to let you know that we've got distinguished panelists here who will have stories and strategies of how civil society and youth can amplify their voices in energy policy and collaboration with key stakeholders.
My first panelist is Sheila Aparocha. She's a leader in gender and energy, works for an organization called Energia, and has about 26 years experience in women's empowerment in energy access. The second is Hadiza Abdulmumini, and she's also done quite impactful work promoting youth leadership and equitable clean energy access and advancing clean cooking practices in Nigeria, and she's a global focal point for the SGD 7 in Nigeria. So really quickly, I'd just like to jump right in it. I have questions for both of you. First is, what inspired each of you to engage in the energy sector in Africa? I'll start with you, Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm humbled that you call me a leader. So it's an honor for me to be on this panel and to contribute to the discussion and discourse taking place at M300. To be honest, my entry into the energy sector was not particularly exciting. I was fresh out of university, an opportunity provided itself, and so I took that opportunity. But over the years, what has been more fascinating for me is to draw the parallels between my first job, which was a veterinary doctor after graduating from the University of Zambia, and my work at the intersection of gender and energy, supported by my second degree from the Asian Institute of Technology in Gender and Development Planning. What surprised me is that in both, you have to go beyond the obvious. When you're treating an animal, which is a client who doesn't speak to you, or when you are trying to address the challenges of women empowerment in the energy sector, what's obvious, it's the root causes, and what's obvious on the surface is not always the real picture. So when I take a gender lens to technical solutions, I'm forced to ask critical questions. Who is benefiting? Who controls the decisions over use? What are the power dynamics between those who have and those who do not have? And that's what really keeps me excited and keeps me motivated. Thank you.
Okay, and Hadiza, same question, but you also, a follow-up question would be, how do you see the role of civil society and youth organizations in shaping Africa's energy policy?
Okay, thank you. I think the inspiration for me was mostly because of the lack of stable access to electricity in my country. Growing up, electricity was not stable, and the frustration for that would be just because you're unable to watch maybe some of your kids' shows, cartoons, and all of that. But as I was growing older, it became to be a bigger problem because you're unable to really work. It threatens your work. These days, most of the work are virtually. You need your computer, and oftentimes you are scared because you have a meeting and there's no electricity for you to power these gadgets that you have to use to attend the meetings. And then you come to see that it's even beyond the individual perspectives. It's even for the country itself, Nigeria. You see a lot of companies just picking up their investments and leaving because the profit is just going back to getting diesel to power up generators, and that's just not profitable. So I thought, what's the best thing I can do? Because if others can have stable electricity, then we can also have stable electricity. So I did the best way I know how, which is law and policy. And this is the short of my own inspiration. Then in terms of the role of civil society organizations and youth organizations, I believe they play a very critical role in shaping Africa's energy future. And this is because you see that across the globe, youths in Africa, for instance, they are taking so much leadership in terms of exploring what are the sustainable energy solutions that are available. And together with these organizations, you see advocacy and policy influence. So they look at what are the best ways, what policies would enable us to promote and prioritize energy access? How can we expand sustainable energy solutions? So this is very, very important. And then secondly, they are able to hold the government accountable and private institutions accountable for their energy-related actions and policies. And then you talk about skilling and awareness. So let me give you an example with what we do in terms of awareness. So before I became the global focal point of the SH7 Youth Constituency, I was the regional focal point for West and Central Africa. So as a regional focal point, your responsibility is first to see what are those immediate needs in the organization for your own region. And the first thing we saw was for West and Central Africa, it's even very important for us to begin with the awareness in terms of what are those communities that don't even have energy access? Then what are the alternative sources? There's a lot of problems, for instance, in my own country with the transmission lines. So there's a need for you to really raise awareness on the need for decentralized energy solutions. So the first thing we did at that level was awareness campaign, the sustainable sources available, the consequences of all of these sources, among others. So this is in terms of awareness, one of the responsibilities. And then secondly, you also talk about fostering skilling and after skilling innovation. So right now, as the global focal point of the constituency, the role is to see what are the best ways to support youth. And one very important and interesting program we have is the Youth Sustainable Energy Hub. So it's a hub that gives room to all youths across the globe to come and showcase the youth-led energy projects that they have. And right now, what we are planning to do is to showcase them based on region, and they get access to capacity building, financing, mentorship, and some of the partners for these programs that we've had, IRENA, IEA, REN21, UN Energy, SE for All, among others. So this is one of the areas that you see youth organizations and civil society organizations creating that opportunity and allowing for a just and inclusive transition and also energy access. And then this is the same thing for skilling too. You look at areas that youth don't have skills and we're able to work with.
Okay, thank you. Now back to Sheila. Do you have examples of how civil society can play an effective role in energy policy?
Yes. Actually, my fellow speaker has already said everything that I want to say and also given excellent examples. But let me just, there's a saying, you have to know where you're coming from to know where you're going. And I think it's important if we step back, whether it is 2015 or 2021 when we had the World Summit of Sustainable Development and you couldn't talk about energy poverty, 2015 when you have the SDGs, on going forward, that civil society organizations were the first to start talking about, for instance, decentralized renewable energy, clean cooking solutions, before our governments and our private sector came on board. So I think it's very good to recognize that. And having said that, we're here in Tanzania, so I'll just give two examples. Tatedo, you cannot work in the energy sector if you don't know about Tatedo. Tatedo has been a shining example for over 30 years, really bringing inclusive business models, testing them, making them proven business models. A lot of that we're using today, whether we're talking about multifunctional platforms that they started with, to mini-grids, to now using electric cooking and trying to make that affordable. So that's 30 years. The Tanzania Sustainable Energy and Gender Network, really working on empowering, creating a much more enabling policy environment for women in the energy sector, have been catalytic in working in partnership with the Ministry of Energy in Tanzania in developing the Sustainable for All Gender Action Plan. And right now are also innovating in village-level adaptation plans, not national, but village-level adaptation plans really driven by villages and aggregating them so that they can feed into district-level planning. Nigeria. I saw Habiba today, so I'm going to be remiss if I don't mention Society Renewable Energy Technologies and Solar Sisters. You know, when we talk about CSOs, it's not just NGOs. Yeah. We had mini-grids developers here saying they're not making profits. They are also part of the CSOs. Here, these are two organizations that over 10 years or more have empowered thousands of women entrepreneurs in very rural and remote areas in Nigeria where nobody else is. Nobody else is in these communities. I've been there to get business skills, deliver clean energy products, and even be innovative with digital literacy. Currently, Solar Sister is piloting a solar mill machine based in local communities, so you don't have to transport things, the long travel and the distance that women have to take in order to transport their farming products to mill. So those are two. And of course, your own organization that's working on accountability in the country.
Thank you. Sheila, again, just a follow-up question. How can gender considerations drive more inclusive and sustainable energy access outcomes?
Okay. Thank you for the question. So inclusive and sustainable outcomes, that's what we want to focus on. So within Energy's experience, we feel that there are 4 critical approaches. The first one is to end energy poverty for women. UN Women has said in their snapshot for 2024, and by the way, this year is the 30th celebration of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action that our member states committed to women's economic empowerment and gender equality. The last year that SDG 5 is going to be reviewed, but their report is still showing us the majority of poor women in the world are based in the continent, and the majority of those poor women are energy poor. So ending energy poverty is really important. A very interesting statistics that I saw was for me is that for every 100 men, there are 127 women. Now, what's interesting is the age group, and they're living in extreme poverty. So there are different levels of poverty. This is the group between 25 and 34. That means for the years that are supposed to be your most productive is the years that you cannot not afford or access energy. So that's going to be one. So we need targeted interventions, gender interventions that really put women at the center of, for instance, our Mission 300 contacts. And why I say intentional is because I recognize when our one of our moderators was speaking to our ministers, one of the questions she asked, if you're in the room, is about women's empowerment and gender equality. She added it into the questions, and none of our ministers answered that question. So we really do have to be intentional in making this difference. So that's one. The second one, I want to go beyond markets. Social safety networks. Let's be honest, there's still a large percentage of our population that are not going to afford even the most basic. We heard from the World Bank president that energy is a public good, it is a right. So social safety nets for those who cannot afford, social security safety nets for those who cannot afford, is really going to be critical. We also heard from the last speakers about how local communities are considered risk averse to adopting some of these technologies. That's not the case. It's not all about behavioral science. It's because they have very vulnerable incomes. You know, they have very little buffer for economic shocks. Right. So then if you're going to take something and you're thinking, how am I going to pay for it? How am I going to pay it off? You're going to be, of course, you're going to think twice before you take it on. If we have social safety networks that will allow people to afford this, it's really going to be important. So apart from the market, we also have to think of these other things. I know that you're asking me to finish. I'm going to just say two statements. I'm looking at my good friend Dimfna, and I think on this panel where we have CSOs, we do have to repeat it. We have to think of holistically about SDG 7. SDG 7 has universal access to energy, which is universal access to clean cooking and universal access to electricity. So we need to have both. You can't do one before the other. Okay. We know that, so electricity needs to be a trailblazer for bringing clean cooking. And clean cooking because it saves lives. In fact, my 26 years of experience is going to allow me to be so bold as to say, if you do not have clean cooking in your initiative, it's a gender-blind initiative. It's going to increase inequalities. It's not pro-women. All right. So, okay, I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's bring youth into this. Hadiza, youth play a key role, obviously. How can we enhance the inclusivity of youth voices in the energy spaces?
Okay, thank you. I think one stark reality that we must acknowledge, which is why I'm so happy for this question, is at the tables where critical policies are being shaped, you simply do not find youth voices. You simply do not find youth there. And it's not because they don't want to be there. And youth have fresh perspectives, innovative ideas, and they hold the long-term impact of these policies that are being shaped today. They are rather seen as passive beneficiaries instead of the agent of change that they are, or the partners in shaping these policies. And I believe some of the reasons for these marginalizations is because maybe there's lack of trust in the capabilities of youths, or maybe there's no resources to engage them, or there's no knowledge of all these initiatives and activities that youths are putting to show their interest and their need to really shape all these policies that are being made. Now, these are my recommendations in terms of how youth can really be made inclusive and to help shape these policies. One is to have a formal youth engagement mechanism, a youth advisory council. And this was the case I saw in the UAE. In the UAE, United Arab Emirates, both public institutions, private institutions, government institutions, all these institutions, they are required by law to have a youth advisory body. So for every policy that they make, you know that it has the perspectives of the younger generations contained therein. Then secondly, if the fear or the reason for not engaging youth is because there's fear of, or there's doubt as to their capabilities, then train them. Recently, I serve as the co-chair of the Arena Youth Council. Then we organized the Arena Youth Forum along the sidelines of the Arena Assembly. And a lot of youth from over 50 countries came. There was it was very, very intensive, but there was a lot of opportunities for youth, and they were able to be merged together with leading experts in the energy sector. And one thing that I realized was the UAE youths, they stood out. Some of them in the workshops I attended, they have served as negotiators, and they were sort of given a workshop on that. They were aware of their country's NDCs, of their country's energy plans. So they have that sense of ownership. If you are able to train the youths and make them understand what the position is, then you give them that sense of ownership and you get to have more out of them. And then secondly, all these youth organizations, CSOs, invest in them so they could further amplify their impact. And then lastly, for missions such as Mission 300, I think it's very important that we have a platform that removes all this geographical barrier, an online platform that allows you to have all the youths there. So at all times, from the beginning, middle, up until the end, you get to ask, and you hear without any filter, what are their thoughts, how is it going, what are their suggestions on this project. I believe this way is able to bring about youth inclusion.
Yeah, we just have a minute and a half, so I'll just jump to the last question for both of you. How do you think civil society can better collaborate with the other stakeholders, government and private sector? You've got a minute for both of you.
Okay. So I'll just be quick then. Okay. So I believe the collaboration is very essential, as we're all aware, but oftentimes it doesn't happen because of some barriers, lack of trust, lack of communication, bureaucracy, red tape hindering of project implementation, or just different priorities and agendas. So if this, all these barriers could be removed, then the rules of the civil society organizations, youth organizations, they'll be able to work collaboratively with the government. The government does the policies, the private sector bring the investment, and the CSOs are the ones that are willing to go to the grassroots level. And for all this role, for instance, of the CSOs, you have the policy advocacy, skilling, fostering innovation. If they're able to do it together and work as one, it will have more impact. Oftentimes you see that the skilling itself, even the government officials, they do need it. Sometimes for these policies that are being made, you see that the CSOs can bring that evidence from the grassroots engagement that they've had, and you have policies that are more effective.
Thank you. Sheila, same question.
You. Yes, a minute and a half, but because this is I think there are only 2 spaces in this conference where civil society is, please allow me to add an extra minute. I think we are entitled to that. We're going to be remiss if to respond to your last question about youth empowerment and women's empowerment, if we don't talk about jobs and leaderships. We saw examples of wonderful leaders, including Her Excellency, the president of the country that's hosting us, but there are too few women in the sector. And as jobs are being created in the clean energy transition, this could go to youth and women. But also very much, from our experience, it's not so much on the supply side. Yes, we need to promote STEM education, but it's on when they get into these positions that the environment needs to be made safe for them to excel. So we're talking about anti-harassment policies, we're talking about equal opportunity policies. These are things that we really need to encourage in our sector. And now about civil society, I want to first, and I think we're all going to do that, we are going to underscore and acknowledge the engagement that we have on the 20th of January with mission, with the Mission 300 initiative, where a statement was already made. So all our points were captured there. And just to underscore that, it was about inclusive multi-stakeholder processes and providing real leadership linked to that. It was about openness and trust in the relationships that we have. And part of that was really sharing timely information that we need. It was about funding our NGOs, particularly youth and women's organizations, but also community-based, to meaningfully engage in these. They do also need to have part of the funding, part of the billions that have been allocated should also go to civil society organizations. And the fourth is actually a shout out to us CSOs. And to CSOs like myself, the more established, more international, that we need to give way to our local African CSOs to lead the way. Let us come in and support them so that we together can have a collective voice. Rather than, engaging in these initiatives one-on-one, we need to have a collective voice and really be, that will strengthen our position.
Can we end there?
Okay. So I'll end.
All right. Sheila and Isa, please, a warm round of applause for them. It's been excellent.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, and there you have it, the voice of civil society, loud and clear in the room. Thank you very much for your contributions, and to our moderator and our panelists. Again, we're moving at lightning speed, ladies and gentlemen, as we move to our next short and sharp, concise conversation. Its focus is on innovative finance, and particularly wanting to also include a perspective on local currency. It's my pleasure to welcome the CEO of the British International Investment, that is, of course, Mr. Leslie Marsdorp. Thank you for being here, Leslie. And joining him on stage is Jules Ngakam, the CEO of the Africa Guarantee Fund. Welcome, Jules. And Rachel More Oshodi, the CEO of Arm Harith, in particular the Arm Harith Infrastructure Investment Limited, rather. Ladies and gentlemen, we hand over now to Leslie to lead us in this conversation. Leslie, over to you.
Thank you very much, moderator, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Like all the other sessions before this one, I believe that innovative finance is the most important subject for us over this conference, this summit. I say that because there is a search underway. We are going back to the laboratories, if you like, to find new ways, to find ways in which we can reinvigorate, retool the development finance system to deal with the modern challenges that we face today. I mean, as a starting point, as you know, dating back way back to 1944, when the development finance system was really established with the World Bank. Since then, with only $20 billion of paid-in capital, more than $1 trillion have been raised through the power of leverage through the capital markets. 20 years ago or so, in Monterrey in Mexico, the concept of innovative finance was really sort of born. It was captured in the final communique of the Finance for Development Summit, and since then there's been considerable innovation. We've had blended finance structures, we've had green and sustainability bonds, we've had IFM, for example, create a set of instruments where we were able to raise through advanced market commitments specific bonds, which is really what led to Gavi becoming one of the most successful public-private partnerships over the last 2 decades. However, there's still a significant financing gap. So we're here to talk about that subject, and I'm joined by 2 very esteemed panelists who have very deep experience, each more than 20 years of experience in investment banking, private equity, and development finance. So we want to drill more into that concept today. I'll start with you, Rachel. Rachel is the CEO of ARM Harith Infrastructure Investments. And I want to ask you, what do you see as the remaining to investment in the energy sector? And afterwards I'll come to what solutions do you think we can propose?
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I delve into what the issues are, just want to specify exactly what we do at ARM Harris. So we are a private equity firm focused on investing in essential infrastructure assets across West Africa. So from access to energy to efficient transport and connectivity, we focus on projects that have the potential to deliver strong returns to investors as well as a major impact on the communities. So what we've faced over the years, of course, doing infrastructure, is that we're dealing with a very volatile environment, from regulations to our currencies to the landscape and access to finance. The key issues, especially when dealing with long-dated assets, is that uncertainty is what has prevented really the investing at scale. So even when you are a sophisticated investor, what you are faced with is, from the investor community in providing or looking at those investments, what they're shying away from is the key point really is the volatility. We've gone through devaluations, we've gone through changing regimes, so we've sophisticated our approach in structuring around that. But even at that, what you can do is to limit the losses, but you cannot eliminate them. And so we also coming in very early. Being equity, we're coming at a point at the project cycle when things are still being put in place. There's very few capital that have the patience and the risk appetite to do that. And that has also been another pain point that we haven't yet solved. Lastly, talking about the illiquid nature of that. A lot of investors, and people would mention pension funds in particular when you look at developed market, because the long-term nature of those assets should be a great match for the pension funds. However, for the risk that I've mentioned and for the illiquid nature of the asset we invest in, because it would take you 2 to 3 years to develop a project, another 2 to 3 years to build that project before the assets start generating cash flows. So it's a long time for pension funds not to receive any distribution, and that also has been one of the challenges that we face. Lastly, and I'll stop there, the currency, as I mentioned. One way to mitigate it is, of course, to have the local currency being able to match that of the revenues of the project. But what we face is that the market, the banking market, or at least the investor market, the financing market, generally speaking, is not deep enough to provide the long tenured that are required and the quantum that is required for those very capital-intensive projects.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'd like now to move over to Jules Ngangam, who's the CEO of the Africa Guarantee Fund. How is the fund responding to these challenges with respect to the solutions that you believe you are offering the market?
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so we started a point on the barriers because at AGF, the product that we are offering were designed to address those barriers. And when we talk about barriers for investment in the GRE, on the renewable, is as opposed to traditional investment, because all sort of investment, they have their own barriers. But when it comes specifically to the renewable sector, I would say the main challenge is liquidity, is this arbitrage between CapEx and OpEx. You know, investors, they will tend to go for projects that have a lower CapEx but higher OpEx. Because what we are telling them is that upfront they need to invest a huge amount of money, but they will get the payback over a long period of time. The next challenge is mainly on the duration. You know, the duration is the fact that the payback period is quite long, and we have a mismatch between the type of resources that the investors have, the tenor, compared to the tenor of the project. We have the collateral, which is a major one. You know, when it comes to the renewable, the investors tend to apply a high haircut to the collateral value of the equipment. You know, the way they assess the equipment, the collateral value is it kind of easy to resell those equipment in the secondary market? And is very challenging to resell those types of equipment. And when it comes also to the issue around the maintenance, and because of that, the depreciation ratio for equipment in the renewable sector tends to be very high. So they depreciate those equipment kind of very fast. Rachel mentioned the currency challenge, the information, lack of information. So our products have been designed to address liquidity, the duration challenge, the lack of information, and our product goes mainly around guarantees. So we have loan guarantees in a portfolio basis, individual basis, depending on the size of the transaction, because we want to cover the entire value chain when it comes to the energy space, you know, from the very small SMEs to the medium one. And the loan guarantee helps to address the issue of collateral. We do provide also the bank fundraising guarantee to help those investors to provide long-term finance to the SMEs to reduce the mismatch in terms of duration. We have the equity guarantee, which is a very critical one because we have realized that they kind of rely heavily on debt finance. So we do also attract investment on the equity space, you know, to be able to help them to have long-term financing.
Thank you very much, Jules. Now, let me come back to Rachel. You know, over the years, British international investment have found that the availability of local currency is a central ingredient of being successful in a number of markets on the African continent. You run a multi-currency fund. How important is the local currency offering in your view?
Thanks. It is critical. And for the second fund that we're raising is the key element, really, that we're focusing on. Why? Because for the first fund, we did take investors in local currency, but then converted it in hard currency, because there were so many issues at the time that we couldn't fix. And today we are proud to say that we are able to invest local currency into local projects alongside international capital, because sometimes the two don't necessarily match, and the risk profile of the investors are also different. Mm-hmm. So that's truly the blended nature of what we've been able to do.
So you're able to bring in sort of local pension funds, local institutions into those investments? Absolutely.
Seeing eye to eye as to how the capital, because really what we do is really take the right kind of capital for the right type of projects and in the right capital structure. And that's the most efficient way to really leverage both local and international. So we've learned from discussing with the pension funds, and I did mention the illiquid nature, right? Even when you look at developed market, it took the pension funds a long time to get to where they are today. Today we see them owning assets, but they were first very hesitant about that until they were able to master it. And there's a lot that needs to happen at the regulatory level. And because we are not there yet, all markets within where we operate are not there yet. So what we do is that we're very selective in the type of project that we do, where we know we can minimize the impact of regulation, if not eliminate it fully by engaging bilaterally. So we've learned lessons the hard way, but what we are able to do is to really bring both the local currency, the hard currency, so how we source equipment, where we locate the projects, how do we use the civil work, and why do we need to go and put dollars against it when we can do it locally? So it also encouraging to start building industries locally. So it's critical, and I think it's really a game changer, and we would not be able to do that if we didn't have concessional capital or junior equity, essentially. So what the DFIs are doing is supporting fund managers like us to really de-risk those projects, because as sophisticated as we are as fund managers and having done a lot of projects on the continent, we do not control the monetary policies. We do not control the regulation. We can, of course, influence that by bringing the private sector perspective in those discussions. And we don't also control the fact that by nature, those projects take a long time to get on stream. But to enable and attract pension funds, in spite of that, we need to have a capital that is patient and that could take the first loss.
Thank you.
Right? So this is quite critical. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jules, I wonder if I could ask you whether you think that the moment has now arrived where guarantees have really kind of, if you like, getting the moment in the sun. I mean, as you know, Ajay Banga, one of his first initiatives was to establish a private sector lab, and one of their first recommendations was bringing together the guarantee product of the World Bank, the IFC, IDA, and it looks like there's now a clear recognition that guarantees have a significant role to play to mobilize private sector capital. Are you very confident that that moment has arrived now for guarantees to be much more central to the finance offering for development finance?
Yes, absolutely. I think the time has come to leverage more on this type of product, and I will mainly give the case of AGF, why we believe that today we are well positioned, we are best positioned to tackle the challenge when it comes to the renewable space. So I'll give you maybe 5 main reasons. The first one is on the product. We launched the Green Guarantee Facility a decade ago, and we are in a position where we have a track record on what works best. So we believe that at the product level today, we have a product that was designed to tackle the challenge facing that sector. The second reason is our coverage, our continental coverage. We've signed guarantees in 44 countries in Africa, and then we believe that by partnering with the GFI, with the donors, they can have access to all that coverage. And the third one is partnership. Partnership is very critical. We've been able to build partnership with more than 250 banks across the continent. And the third one is our rating. Our rating, we are the best rated private company in Africa with a rating of AA- issued by Fitch. And we believe that the financial institution can leverage on that, mainly when it comes to credit enhancement. We talk about the issue about currency. The main reason why those SMEs, they prefer to borrow in hard currency is the cost. It's cheaper to borrow in hard currency, but they don't see the currency risk. If we can lower also the interest rate for the investment in local currency, will play a huge role. And we believe that by leveraging on our rating, the financial institution can achieve that. Yes, and the last one is the leverage. The fact that with $1 of resources, we can channel $10 of private capital to the players in the GI space.
Thank you very much. Rachel, if I could return to you, I mean, we have private sector players, institutions here in the room. What would you say are the sort of core propositions why investors should, for example, who are interested in the ARM Harith Infrastructure Fund, why should they invest? What's the core proposition that you are putting forward?
Thank you for that. So I think it's really the fact that we have boots on the ground and solving for the issues hands-on. So for every single evolution, I guess, in our industry, you need to have new products. And I'll give an example. I was mentioning that investors, particularly the local investors, and the reason why I'm insisting on the pension funds is that right now, it is probably what could bridge the gap for setting this infrastructure play that we're all talking about, because there's a lot of capital that is there that could be unlocking what we're trying to do. And so, to give an example on the illiquid nature of the assets, we realized that it was a key pain point for them, more so than the returns. So we collaborated with the DFI in order to have a pocket of capital that would not necessarily be first loss, but that would provide early yield to those pension funds. It's never been done, right? So but we needed to do that to unlock that particular capital. And they welcomed that with open arms, and now we are having more local investors coming in, because now they don't have the pain point of waiting 5 to 6 years before getting the first distribution, right? So those kind of example is truly being agile, really having boots on the ground and understanding what are the issues, and having the network to bring stakeholders together to co-create solutions so we can keep moving forward while we fix the bigger issues at the macro level.
Jules, if I could ask you the same question. If you were sitting in front of potential investors, donors, institutions, what is the core proposition, why they should put money into the Africa Guarantee Fund?
Yes. So the core proposition is our ability to mobilize private capital, because we believe that GFI alone, donor, they will never have enough resources to address the challenges that we face in the energy space. So we need to mobilize or channel the private capital that sits in Africa in the banking sector. And this is our core value proposition as AGF, because with our guarantee product, with our technical assistance, we have the tools, we have the capacity, the reaching, the leverage to channel enough capital from the private sector where it's needed.
Thank you very much. We've unfortunately run out of time. I'll just make a couple of very brief remarks in summary. I mean, as you have heard, there's considerable momentum today in terms of finding new solutions for our institutions to become laboratories, if you like, to search for new ideas of how to finance development. We know that traditional sources of finance are too limited. Overseas development aid is too limited and constrained. So we have to go back to the drawing boards. And the only way to go back to the drawing boards is to find instruments and ways to leverage and to mobilize the institutional investor capital that sits in sovereign wealth funds, that sits in pension funds, that sits in insurance companies. But the traditional sort of methods of doing that have not succeeded, especially on the African continent, where the markets are still perceived to be too risky. And I'd like to just end off by saying two sentences about British international investment. We have been on the continent for many, many decades, and specifically have a unique positioning in terms of deploying equity, the riskiest part of the capital structure, making equity investments in many African countries, because we take this very long-term view and want to contribute to long-term deepening of financial markets, deepening and strengthening of the capital markets, because that's the only way really to have sustainable long-term development. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I'll give it back to the moderator.
Thank you very much. Un grand merci à notre modérateur et à nos panélistes pour ce panel dynamique et pour tous ces éléments partagés avec tant de précision et d'implication. Nous continuons notre série de discussions sur ce plateau et nous abordons à présent un sujet également capital, l'avenir des affaires dans le secteur énergétique en Afrique. Ce panel explorera les opportunités, les défis et les transformations nécessaires pour construire un avenir énergétique prospère et durable pour le continent. Thank you very much, mesdames et messieurs. Et pour modérer cette discussion, yes, we can. Thank you very much. Et donc, ce que je disais, c'est que pour modérer la prochaine discussion, j'ai le plaisir d'inviter sur scène Cathy Oxby, qui est directrice commerciale d'Africa Green Co. C'est une organisation qui est pionnière dans l'innovation énergétique et les solutions commerciales en Afrique. Et elle sera accompagnée de deux éminents intervenants, Alain Ebobissé, qui est directeur général d'Africa 50, un fonds d'investissement qui catalyse, vous le connaissez certainement, le développement des infrastructures sur le continent, et Dadmadou Tadessé, président et directeur général de la Banque de commerce et de développement, un acteur clé également du financement et du soutien aux projets de transformation et en Afrique. Alors, mesdames et messieurs, merci d'accueillir notre prochain panel sur scène. Alain Ebobissé, Dadmadou Tadessé et Cathy Oxby. Please, ladies and gentlemen. Alors c'est étrange, mais j'ai l'impression que les membres de ce panel ne sont pas encore prêts. On va donc devoir les attendre pendant quelques instants. J'ai bien vu quelqu'un qui semble être allé les chercher. Donc je vous demanderai de bien vouloir patienter quelques instants et pourquoi pas de discuter avec vos voisins de tout ce qui vient d'être dit durant ce précédent panel. Donc on va patienter quelques instants. Merci. Ainsi que la modératrice sont présents. Alors, nous vous avons déjà invité sur scène. Je vais donc vous réinviter sur scène. Mesdames et messieurs, s'il vous plaît, Alain Ebobissé, directeur général d'Africa 50, Dadmadou Tadessé, président et directeur général de la Banque de commerce et de développement, accompagné de Cathy Oxby, directrice commerciale d'Africa Green Co, la modératrice de ce panel. Je vais vous demander de les accueillir chaleureusement. Nous les avons attendus. Ils sont là. Merci beaucoup. Vous pouvez commencer, je vous en prie.
Speaking to an empty room.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying on for this panel. Firstly, thank you to our generous host, the Republic of Tanzania, as well as, of course, to the AFDB, the World Bank, and the Rockefeller Foundation. I am honoured to be joined on the panel today by Mr. Alain Abobise, the CEO of Africa 50, and Mr. Admasu Tadesse, the CEO of the Trade and Development Bank. Both of the institutions, as I'm sure you are fully aware, are very active in the African energy sector with a footprint across the continent. So thank you for joining us today to share your insights on the topic of the future of the African energy business. So I'm Cathy Oxby, the Chief Commercial Officer of Africa Green Co, which may be less familiar to some of you. We are a renewable energy trader within the Southern African Power Pool, headquartered in Zambia, and using the regional integration that we've been focusing on today as a diversifier and mitigant of risk to help attract finance into new generation capacity. So as we've heard already a lot today, around the activities going on in the sector and looking at particularly at the 5 priority pillars of Mission 300, we see strides being made under all of those pillars to some extent. Looking at the Southern African Power Pool has been operating already for 15 years or so. The East African Power Pool and the West African Power Pools are finalising their market rules with a view to launching their own regional competitive markets shortly. On the transmission front, we have initiatives such as the Regional Transmission Infrastructure Financing Facility being promoted by SAP to improve the regional interconnection. And in parallel, a lot of regulatory change underway to facilitate more private sector investment. Now, gentlemen, we've been given a very broad topic to discuss. The sector is rife with opportunity, and there's plenty of space for innovation, and a lot already being done. We need to be bold, and we need to move fast. We need to avoid reinventing the wheel, and we need to identify the most promising initiatives to scale. What do you see as the key trends that will drive the future of the African energy business? And how are your institutions lined up to take advantage of these opportunities?
Oh, well, do I start?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to the World Bank and the African Development Bank and, of course, Tanzania for hosting this important event. In terms of key trends, I think I will start by saying that we will continue to see a huge growth in the demand for electricity on the continent as the population grows and also as we get a bigger middle class, and also because of our industrialization needs on the continent, and not to mention the AI, ICT, huge amount of demand for electricity. So we should expect a significant increase in demand. So we need to fund a number of projects across the value chain, generation, transmission, and distribution. I also see that there will be a higher penetration for renewables in the energy mix. Of course, in Africa, we want a balanced energy mix which has renewable but also gas to provide balancing power. So we see that also, and that actually has a real impact in terms of how do we organize our grid and etc. I see also a lot more investment going into distributed renewable energy, because of course we need to make sure that this is one of the goals of this event, to have a lot more access to power across the continent. And finally, I would say that I see a lot more investment coming through in terms of transmission, power transmission across the continent, and especially from the private sector side. Us at Africa 50, we started to talk about transmission PPP in Africa for some time now, 4 years. I'm glad to see that my partner, the CEO of KETRACO, John Mativo, is here, because in Kenya, we hope to do the first transmission PPP in the trunk line, the first independent power transmission, and Masu is part of the team that is also working on doing that. So these are some of the trends that I see, but all of those trends will result of significant investment needs that for sure the public sector cannot cover. So we're likely to see a lot more private investment in the power sector, in the energy sector in Africa. And the question will be, how do you make it happen? How do you create those bankable projects that the private sector is ready to finance? How do you mitigate the risk? And we can talk about some of the solutions that we are implementing at Africa 50.
Thank you. Admasu.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Very pleased to be here. Alain kicked off by highlighting some of the demand side factors, and he made references not just to the normal demand, but ICT. Inside there you have data centers, all these new developments that are also competing for energy. What has been fascinating to observe is just the way technology has been maturing in the various segments. We've seen it, of course, have huge effects in the renewable sector. Of course, wind has been there for some time, but we see massive adoption of solar, very large scale, utility scale, adoption of massive projects. And we're also seeing continued advancements in areas like geothermal, even nuclear. And so it's quite impressive to see how the technology side of things is opening up opportunities and making affordable solutions much more attractive to sovereigns. So the technology side is there. Of course, these days there's a lot of new thinking around AI-enabled solutions around the efficiency problem, because we've known inefficiencies have been a big challenge in the sector. And so that is also coming into play. And then, of course, the 24/7 type renewable energies that we're seeing, the green hydro, the green hydrogen is also opening up a lot of prospects. We're seeing a number of countries move very aggressively into that. There's about 4 or 5 countries in the continent that have really identified that as a very attractive growth area for the future. So I think on the supply side, we're going to continue to see dramatic developments. It's already captivated us. We've seen what's happened. Cost is a very real factor, and I think the supply side issue around gas is going to continue to be hotly debated. I think the base load requirements of the continent will continue to point strongly in the direction of gas, natural gas, and so there we have quite a few discoveries and resources coming online. We are in one of those countries that has those endowments. We've seen what Mozambique has gone through, Namibia as a case in point, Nigeria. And this will also dovetail into the other side of energy, which is clean cooking solutions, which was discussed this morning by the 2 MDB presidents. And so even there, we see very exciting developments where new business models linked to technology is really making alternative, clean home cooking very attractive and feasible. We have received very special purpose funding to actually help accelerate the rollout of distributed renewable energy, mini grids, off grids, and of course new business models in the clean cooking space. And so it's not just the technology side on the supply side, it's also a very deliberate big push on funding. Why we're here, M300. But even before the M300 was announced, we had already been pushing very hard on the DRE side. And we've seen a number of small-scale SME players in the sector take advantage of both the resources, but also the opening up space. I found it quite fascinating that 20 years after the liberalization of the energy sector, this morning we were still talking about trying to get the regulation right, trying to get the policy framework right. And it's fascinating for somebody who's been around this sector for some time. That's something that we were dealing with at the turn of the millennium, right? It's not a new conversation. Reforming infrastructure, reforming energy, unbundling the sector has been, going on for decades. And I really hope that we'll be able to get that institutional innovation to actually come together well. And it's not that we don't know what it takes to get things to happen, but I think this morning President Banga talked about faith and trust. A private sector needs to get to that point of trust, right? It's not just about us saying all the things that should be said. But I think money talks. It's not just, the talk. I think we've heard the big numbers being announced today, the huge amounts of development finance together with concessionary financial resources that are being made available. So that gives me confidence that the needle will begin to move.
Thank you. As they say, money's like water, right? It flows where it's easiest. And so if we want it to flow in the directions necessary to achieve the goals of Mission 300, we need to facilitate the path for it. I think you raised some very interesting points there around the demand side and the interplay with regulatory reforms. Because I think there has been a recognition for longer of the role of the private sector on the generation side. But we're starting to see more recognition that the major consumers, in many cases, are private sector, with the willingness and the appetite to pay for the fuel, and it may not be therefore necessary for the utility to sit in the middle. So we're seeing more countries opening up the sector to allow that private to private. Do you see that as a trend in the countries that you're operating in?
Yeah, I think we see different models that countries are implementing. I think we also see a lot more pragmatism from countries to try to find out what works. So whether you have captive power, so selling electricity directly to private customers is allowed in many countries. But I think what we want to see a lot more really is a huge increase in the pipeline of bankable projects that could attract the pools of capitals that is sitting on the sideline looking for ways in which they could be invested and earn a return. And for us, I think there is a big effort that needs to be made in risk mitigation. Those instruments are available, but they are a bit cumbersome to use. So if we could, facilitate the use of risk mitigation to cover some of the risks that the private sector is not very comfortable to take. But I think for me, it's also a huge amount of effort has to be made in increasing the resources for project development. Project development is essentially the kind of resources that are needed to build up the pipeline of bankable projects, putting money at risk early stage to build the pipeline. And this is what we are doing at Africa 50 with a specialized project development vehicle called Africa 50 Project Development. It's a $100 million facility that is investing in early stage project development. But we are also in the process of raising a $400 million fund called ASIA, the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, that we are co-developing with the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, Africa 50, and a number of partners, investing to build up the pipeline. And we have a number of projects. I think I see the Minister of Finance of Madagascar is here. We are helping the country on the 20-megawatt hydro project, Volobe. I see that my sister from Mozambique, Minister of Foreign Affairs, she's here. And we're looking at power transmission, PPP, at the development stage. Of course, I mentioned Kenya. So there is a lot happening, but what we need to do is speed, faster things, faster, getting things to the financial close quickly and commercial operations quickly, and then scale. So it's nice to do things here and there. We know how to do it. That's the good news. But the not so good news is that we have to do it faster and then at scale.
Thank you. I doubt there's any disagreement in the room that we need to do things faster and bigger. I guess the question is how. And I think you raised the issue of bankability. And certainly through our experiences, I think one of my favorite phrase is bankability is in the eye of the beholder. There is no set in stone rule as to what constitutes a bankable deal. And we need to work together to find new and innovative ways to address risks and to accelerate the closing of these transactions. Through the process of establishing GreenCo, we often encountered that as we were trying to encourage people to think differently about the way risks are covered and power is procured. We often heard, the people say, "Oh yeah, it's a great idea, but it's never going to work. It's too ambitious, it's too big, it's too political." But we carried on, we persevered, and where we are today, I think, is a testament to those who believed. And the Rockefeller Foundation, I have to give a shout out for being our earliest supporter, without whom we wouldn't be here. So I think with Mission 300, we have such a huge backing from these fantastic institutions. So for you, are there particular things that you see as being, or seem to be insurmountable obstacles at this point in time, but in 5-7 years' time, we'll just accept that they are a perfectly normal and acceptable things? What breakthroughs are needed to help achieve the Mission 300 goals? Would you like to take that one, Admasif?
I don't think I heard very well, so I'm going to start using this. I think it's got such a high ceiling here, I think it's swallowing up the sound. So I don't know if Alain heard, maybe.
I'll take the question. I understood that because I'm closer to you, so I can. Look, you're right. There are a number of things that people are always saying it's impossible, and then you have to just be creative and persevere, and then when you get things done, people will follow. Success breeds success. But what seems like impossible at this point, which really we're trying to tackle, is those project development. Project development is hard, it's risky. People spending money early stage before you have the contract is tough. That's why many of the global investors, global power companies, they're leaving Africa because they don't want to risk as much money on the project development space. But we, at Africa 50 and others, we have to tackle project development. We have to spend money early stage to support companies that have good ideas, that want to test the feasibility. We have to do it. And this is a process that hopefully we can scale up, and we are in the process of scaling up. I also want to say local currency. Local currency is it is a game changer, okay? Because financing large pieces of infrastructure with foreign currency, it's possible, but the FX risk is too high. So we need to figure out a way to tackle local currency. I think this is something that institutions such as Africa 50 we are doing. We are doing by mobilizing African pension funds. We launched the Africa 50 Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. We brought together 16 African institutional investors to back our first close at $222.8 million, $2.5 million. It's small, but it's a way to start mobilizing African institutional investors alongside global investors. It's important. So these are the kind of things that seem insurmountable, but once we do it, maybe hopefully more people will come to the party.
Thank you. Excellent point on FX there.
Yeah, Kathy, just to top up on what Alain said, I think we do have some very promising wins in our sales, not just dedicated resources that are being made available, but institutional innovations that even Africa 50 itself represents. If you go back to the turn of the millennium, when we were debating these issues in the context of liberalization and PPPs, there was no Africa 50. Today, you have a dedicated institution like them that can actually get involved early stage and take those risks on a patient basis, like he said. And some of us, of course, have also realized that debt funding is important, but it's not enough. And so we have also begun taking quasi-equity positions in projects when there have been sensitivities around gearing and there being inadequate risk capital. So we've done a combination of senior debt and quasi-equity. We've also decided that we need to also expand our toolkit, in some ways learning from what Africa 50 and others have done by having more technical assistance and grant funding to support project developers in the early stage on a patient basis. It's not like it's free money. It'll be returnable grants if the project succeeds and it becomes reimbursable, and we rechannel it to other deserving projects. And so we have a dedicated vehicle now separate from TDB itself. It's called TDF, and we've managed to attract philanthropic partners in addition to the usual suspects who give concessional and grant funding, that is official development assistance related funding. So there's quite a bit of innovation happening even within the MDB world. I think even the way this M300 initiative has been launched, I think the term was used this morning, many different hands together dealing with this complex challenge. And there's a lot of us who are actually very much engaged in this. I'm working very closely with the World Bank Group in addition to the African Development Bank and the Africa 50. And I'm not just saying this in terms of just general working together. We're talking about facilities and syndications and clubbing together, but also receiving very significant large-scale funding. I mean, 10 years ago, I couldn't tell you that I was a significant partner of the World Bank Group. Today, the World Bank Group has become a major partner of TDB, and we're working closely to help expand the rollout of new business models. As I mentioned earlier on, DRE, distributed renewable energy, but also mini grids, off grids. And we have clients here in Tanzania who've made good use of some of those facilities. This is long-term funding. We can go 15 years. This is for private sector SME lending, right? So if you go back 5 years ago, none of these facilities existed. So, I mean, there's real practical examples that we can point to that shows that, these big policy pushes are getting dedicated funding. Of course, in the final analysis, you need that risk appetite, right? And I think the countries do need to continue investing in creating an attractive and enabling environment. I think that was spoken about again this morning. Predictability is so important. Even though it's obvious, in reality, it's not simple, right? It's an obvious matter, but we've seen setbacks in a number of cases, and we see dramatic shocks happening in some countries. And so I think we just need to keep beating those particular drums because, that's exactly the kind of thing that scares developers away, right? I've been involved in some countries where there were missing links, and you have a pay or take kind of arrangement. And so the power project that was generating the power did their part. And they're like, you were supposed to roll out the transmission line. You didn't. So it's a deemed take. And so the client had to, the sovereign actually had to pay for the power, even though the power wasn't taken. But that's an example of a sovereign that took up its responsibility the right way and realized that they were going to break the project if they didn't actually pay for the power that was not taken because there was no transmission line. And so, I mean, there's a lot of dependencies as well, and I think this is something that experience points out as being something that requires good policy, good planning, good programming to ensure that big investments don't end up, being exposed to missing links that become very, very costly.
Yes, thank you. And I think you were talking there with you about the environment that is needed for this bankability. And I think the private sector is generally good at taking risk if it's able to assess that risk. So you're talking to transparency and predictability and certainty. And those core fundamentals are really the foundations to enable the private sector to play the full role it can play. So we've talked about the unsurmountable but actually surmountable obstacles. There's no such thing as impossible. But we also can't foresee everything that may be around the corner. Are there things, tailwinds or headwinds, that sitting here today, if you had to predict something that we would say in a few years' time, oh, I didn't see that coming?
First of all, I am predicting things that we're working hard to make happen because that's what's going to change the game. I think what we're trying to do to change the game is two things. I think the most important really is to promote very hard and to support a lot more participation of African stakeholders, be it African developers, African investors, African companies into the African power sector, because we work, of course, we're very happy to work with global institutions, global sponsors, but this continent will be developed, the investment will be driven by African stakeholders, and we need to see a lot more of that. And we are working on that. The Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, we have a special bucket too, which is there to support African developers. We also have a bucket that is supporting others. So we need to see that. And again, we're working hard to try to make sure that what really will change the game is to make sure that you have bankable utilities, off-takers that are able really to provide an off-take without government guarantees. If you have that, huge amount of money will come in. We've seen it in other regions. We will see it in Africa. So for me, we'll see it, and I'm working hard to make it happen.
Thank you.
Well, one or two things come to mind. I spoke about the supply side technology-driven dynamics, and some of those move much more quickly than you would have expected. I think on the policy side, there are some developments that appear to be in the making that might, liberalize some aspects of the financing for natural gas projects, because it's not been very easy for African countries to be able to raise financing to develop gas. I think Mozambique was lucky, and they're on a roll. Certainly Tanzania is finally catching up. Namibia, for geopolitical reasons, has managed to attract good attention, the same with Senegal and Mauritania. But I think there may be some dynamics in that space where all of a sudden a window opens for a little bit more access to long-term funding and private sector investment in areas like that. The one thing that I've also been observing with curiosity is the number of countries that are embarking on nuclear power development in the continent. There's quite a few countries that have actually signed up for that, and you hear bits and pieces around that. So I think the diversification of the mix will continue. I don't think it's going to always be in the same way we all expected, but I think in the final analysis, it will be a net positive. And I think, eventually the technologies will become so much more interesting on the renewable side that whether you have strong policy incentives or not, we'll still have a massive expansion of renewable energy. And I'm hoping that that will be the case. On the hydrology side of things, we see some big dams being developed in a number of countries. We hope climate change doesn't affect the hydrology too much. But yeah, that's also a very proven segment of reliable long-term baseload power. And we'll see a few more countries doing that. And but I think that's more of the same kind of development. I think it's the newer stuff that's going to be capturing our attention in a few years to come.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and absolutely. I guess the panacea is the single continental energy market, the dream of the African Union, and we see concrete steps towards that, and to maximising the efficient use of the abundant energy resources that the continent's endowed with, but using those in the most efficient way to achieve the lowest cost energy for all. So with that, I think our time is up. Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your insights. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. A warm round of applause. Thank you so much to your panelists as well. And so, ladies and gentlemen, from a focus on the future of African energy business, turning inwards now to the question of clean cooking. As I invite my panelists to descend the stage, I know that my next set of speakers is standing by, ready to come and join us onto the stage. Introducing the moderator of the session, and that is Rashid Abdallah, Executive Director at the African Energy Commission, or AFREC. Rashid, let's give Rashid a round of applause. Thank you so much, Rashid, for being here. And joining Rashid is Peter Scott, the CEO of Burn Manufacturing. Peter, welcome. Thank you for being here. Martin Kimani, CEO of MGAS. Please join us up on stage, gentlemen. And Dr. Richard Muyungi, Special Envoy to the President of the United Republic of Tanzania. Ladies and gentlemen, at this moment, I'm going to yield the floor to Mr. Abdallah to lead the panel discussion. Sir, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think this topic of clean cooking, I keep hearing it from the morning, and this shows the importance of this topic. I heard from Adesina, I heard from Sheila, and I heard in Compact, and it is very obvious that the electricity access is take more attention in all the discussion. But people sometimes forget that, yes, we have 600 million without access to electricity, but we have 1 billion without access to the clean cooking. And I think clean cooking by number is need more attention for all of us. And just as the introduction of this discussion, in 2024, AFREC is released one publication on scaling up the clean cooking and to identify the challenge. We try to move from this 1 billion without the clean electricity, but we try to identify what this costs us as Africa. And by very conservative estimation, this poverty in clean cooking costs us like 790 billion per year. This just negative externality from gender equality, climate change, and also health. In this session, we are going to discuss some aspect of the clean cooking, and I'm very happy to have with me Dr. Richard Muyungi, a special envoy to the President of Republic of Tanzania, and also we have Mr. Peter Scott, CEO and founder of Burn Manufacturing. And also we have with me Martin Kimani, CEO of MGAS. Without further introduction, I just go directly to the question. Let me start with Mr. Peter Muyungi. We are here in the country that from the President is spearheads the clean cooking. And in just recently, Tanzania, they published their clean cooking strategy 2024 to 2034. Just as introduction, Dr. Richard, just try to tell us what's the challenge and the opportunity that you are facing in developing and implementing this strategy, and how the other African country can benefit from your experience in Tanzania.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rashid. I'll start with the context. Why we think and why Excellence decided to come up with this strategy. You need to think and understand what lack of clean cooking means to many African countries, and in particular what that was translating into in Tanzania. So when you only have 6.9% of your population with clean cooking, this translates into about 33,000 people dying annually because of the increased use of what we call solid fuels. This translates into deforestation, which is estimated at beyond 400,000 hectares of forest annually, partially contributed for the need of charcoal and firewood. This translates into loss of time for girls, which would have been used economically, also for schooling. This translates into loss of biodiversity and land degradation. So it is because of that, Her Excellence saw that it is important to show the leadership on how we need to change the situation. And this is the reason in March last year, we were able to launch the very first national clean cooking strategy. Now, what has that done so far? And what others can learn from us, because this is the question. One, in order to transform the systems at the national level in terms of clean cooking, the first thing, you need the highest level of political commitment. And this is what we have seen from Her Excellence, because the launch of the strategy was done by herself. And of course, therefore, this translates into actions by all ministries. So what we have learned is that, one, the highest level of political commitment is needed across the continent to be able to put in place a system which can work for others. Secondly, is coordination. Before the strategy, clean cooking was not well coordinated. But now, with the strategy, clean cooking is coordinated under the Prime Minister's office, bringing together all key stakeholders, including the private sector. So this is important. So you have a system in place which is under a single strategy which coordinates all the players. Thirdly, the engagement of the private sector. And this is very important. To address clean cooking in Tanzania would certainly require the engagement of private sector in all fronts. And we have been able, through the clean cooking strategy which we have in place, to engage key players, and some of my colleagues will be speaking about that, to ensure that clean cooking has been able to embrace everyone as a national agenda. Thirdly, it's about education, research, and innovation. We need to put in place innovative systems to ensure that you can address clean cooking based on the innovations which are critical and important for the communities you are addressing. You need to address clean cooking from a better understanding of who are engaged in clean cooking and whom you intend to serve, and their level of engagement, but also their level of understanding as well as their financial levels. This is critically important. And therefore, you can come up with innovations which target the financing approaches, different financing approaches, different systems targeting different community levels, and also being able to ensure that the networks you put in place are able to reach out. And lastly, and which I want also colleagues to learn from us, is also the participation of all partners. So it's not only the private sector in Tanzania, but working with the partners. We are now working with the World Bank, with the African Development Bank, with the EU and all partners to engage in implementing our strategy. So these are the areas, because I have 3 minutes in brief, which we think our colleagues can learn in terms of what we have been able to do, and which we believe by 2034, at least 80% of Tanzanians will move from the current systems they are using to cleaner technologies and innovations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Richard. I think you highlight very important things: political engagement, coordinations, engagement of the private sector, education, financing approach, and partner. I think this very key area, and thank you for that. My Next question to the Peter Scotts, and I think, as I mentioned, in 2024 we launched this publication. One of the main recommendations we have that we need to develop a basket of solution and baskets of fuel so that we can have this clean cooking facilitated for member states. So as Bern, they are doing all type of technology now in clean cooking. Tell us actually what you are doing as a Bern, and also what some of the factors influencing the adoption of certain technology.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rashid. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. This is the most exciting time in the history of clean cooking. I've been doing this for 30 years, and over the last 30 years, myself and my team, we've built the world's most successful and biggest clean cooking company, and that's called Burn. And we design and manufacture all of our products here in Africa. We have about 3,500 employees. We've made over 5 million stoves. So as Rashid was saying, Africa is very diverse. So we don't make just one product. So we make the world's most fuel efficient wood stove and charcoal stove and ethanol stove and institutional stove and LPG stove that we partner with our friend here, with Martin. So we make a variety of stoves because every country is very different in Africa. So for example, Tanzania is the best market in the whole continent for electric stoves. Whereas in DRC, the grid is not yet developed, and so there we have to bring them the world's most fuel-efficient biomass stoves. So it's a very exciting time, and specifically I want to talk about our new electric stoves. So, people think that electric cooking is too expensive in Africa. We're actually we've rolled out tens of thousands of units of high-tech induction stoves that feature pay-as-you-go technology, IoT monitoring. And so even around this building, we have multiple customers who have switched they've gone from charcoal or kerosene or wood or even LPG and are now cooking with electric. So, people think that you need the grid to roll out electric cooking, which is true. But in fact, the reality is that electric cooking is going to be what's going to allow the grid to expand. In places like Kenya, we have actually spent billions of dollars rolling out the grid, but you didn't give them the ability to utilize it. And that's what electric cooking is going to do, is going to actually help the grid grow and expand. Now, interestingly, if I came here a few years ago, I would say, we don't have any money. There's no money in the sector. Now there's lots of money. There's money, and it's all standing by, and it's standing by waiting for governments to approve carbon credit regulation, which will allow carbon finance to flow. So it's a very different place. Before we would say, there's no funding. It's not possible. The funding is there. And what's required is the governments to execute their regulations, which will allow carbon finance to flow and carbon trading to flow. So I would love it to speak to people afterwards, if they're interested, about how we could bring a carbon finance cook stove and clean cooking project to your country. So we've rolled out this year in Nigeria, in Malawi, in Tanzania, in Ghana. It's all happening, and it's the question of which government will come to the table first to sign up with us to execute this. This last year, we've utilized about $80 million of subsidy. Next year, we'd like to do $250 million of subsidy. It literally can happen now. Please, let's talk.
Okay, thank you very much. And you said a lot, so I cannot summarize. But it is very important that Africa is different. We have different resources. We have different culture of cooking, so we need different solution. Let me go to the Martin Kimani, and I think one of the main issue on clean cooking is affordability and how the payment. And I think as you are pioneers in pay as you go, really try to summarize us how it's doing, how this will help the situation, what the challenge you are facing, what the opportunity is there.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I think it's been very well articulated here that we have an African crisis. The crisis is very clear. There are studies that have articulated that very well. Dr. Muyungi just gave us some more statistics about it. We are losing over 900 million people, or we have 900 million people who are exposed to polluting fuels in Africa. This, in perspective, is about 70% in the continent. If that's not a crisis, I don't know what a crisis is. So we are very clear. We are losing lives, 1,400 lives every day in the continent as a result of exposure to these polluting fuels. So question remains, where is the challenge? And as it's been said here, it's a question of affordability. The reason why most of the households in Africa are preferring to use biomass like charcoal and wood is because they cannot afford upfront the money needed to get the clean cooking accessories. It takes them $50, $70 to onboard yourself as a household into clean cooking. You must agree with me that this is a huge challenge to many households in Africa, and this is why they have been condemned to daily buying charcoal, daily buying firewood, because they cannot raise that cash up front. We've talked about it, and as MGAS, what we bring to the table is how do we execute? How do we close that gap? How do we enable households to be onboarded into clean cooking? And this is how we came up with the innovation that we use today, which is the use of an IoT-enabled smart meter, which we fix into a 13-kilo cylinder together with a cook stove, install that into a household without upfront payments, but then give the household a chance to pay as they need to cook. It's what we are now calling pay as you cook. So a family with 35 cents dollar can cook 3 meals in a day. We've just mirrored the pattern that they used to have previously, but in this case just buying dirty fuels that are harmful to their health and damaging to the environment. So with the same amount, actually lower, they can now cook, or they can now cook using LPG. This is where our pay-as-you-cook or pay-as-you-go model is coming in to fix the gap. And the advantage with this model is its scalability. We have been able to onboard in about 3 years 500,000 households between Kenya and Tanzania. That's not a simple task, but it also shows you, to your question, the opportunities that lie when you engage this kind of financing model. 500,000 homes in Kenya, in perspective, is about 3% of the household population. And this is only within 3 years. So, and this is still together with piloting the product and putting the structures in place. So give or take, and with limited funding, we can be able to scale between 1 million and 2 million households between Kenya and Tanzania. So one of the big advantages is ability to scale and scale quickly. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I must submit to you that the crisis we are dealing with is urgent. There is no time. We need to move with speed. This model helps that scale and within a very short time. So obviously, there are challenges because we are talking about putting in assets within the households without requiring for immediate payment fast, and you allow your revenues to come in over time. That's one of the big challenges, to invest in the infrastructure, to invest in the technology, but once you overcome that hurdle, you're able to progress. Implementation.
Thank you very much. I think you are very passionate about it. And I think everyone should be passionate about this very innovative one. So I think as the time is ticking and we need to cover all the aspects here, I'm coming back to Dr. Richard, and I know that Tanzania is a champion clean cooking, not only in Tanzania, but also at the regional level and international level. So what's the opportunity of synergy between what is happening in Tanzania here and the region and as the continent, as the international. Just briefly, so that we can catch.
I know we don't have much time, but thank you very much again, Rashid. Yes, indeed, Her Excellency Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of Tanzania, she is the champion of clean cooking. You are right said, and in Tanzania and across Africa and now internationally. It is important to elevate clean cooking at the highest level of politics, and therefore to get a champion to do that. And this is why Her Excellency decided that because of the importance of the issue on the continent, she will take the mantle and champion that. And we have done a lot, and there is a need for that. One, it is important to ensure that there is a champion who can elevate clean cooking in terms of partnerships, ensuring that for the continent to be able to succeed in addressing clean cooking, you need to work together. This is an issue, and you said we have 950 million people without lacking clean cooking, and it translates a lot into a lot, in death, deforestation, carbon sink loss, biodiversity loss, etc. So the first thing is how you partner with others to ensure that you address this issue. And this is why you heard this morning, and President Adesina said it rightly, that Mission 300 should also include clean cooking as one of the key areas of support. And we need the 300 million by 2030 to ensure that they are part of the 950 million lacking clean cooking, having clean cooking by 2030. This was said this morning. The second area why we need this sort of elevation at the highest leadership is because we need to change policies. You can only change the way we have been doing clean cooking for the past 30 years if there will be structural policy changes at national level and also at the AU level. To see clean cooking as one of the areas which will need reforms, tax reforms at the national level, ensuring that you change the way governments address clean cooking. You need to transform how the system should work from the top level to the local level. And thirdly, you need to bring new partners. He just mentioned about the carbon markets, etc. But we need new partners in terms of innovations, in terms of technologies. There are technologies out there. We need to see what has been happening in Asia. For the last 10 years, between 2010 and 2021, the clean cooking has been increased by 5.8 in Asia. But in Africa, people lacking clean cooking have increased from 517, now we are talking about 950, about 1 billion. That has to change. How do you change that? You need leadership at the continent level, and I hope supporting Her Excellency will be able to achieve what we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard. Quickly, I need to go to Peter. Now you are the biggest African manufacturing for clean cooking solution.
In the world.
So, in the world also. How you make that? And how this manufacturing is become like a normal norm for each African country? Briefly, we can have like...
Sure. It's very simple. You know, we build and operate modern manufacturing around the continent, and for local or for national governments that also want us to come and build modern manufacturing in your country, it's very simple. If you sign a letter of authorization that allow for corresponding adjustments for carbon credits, the money will flow. So for example, this year we signed the letter of authorization with Malawi. The next week we signed for $20 million of investment. We're now built the factory, and now we're bringing highly subsidized, best-in-class, improved cooking devices to the people of Malawi. So it's that, and we're happy to do that, whether it's in Tanzania or Togo or DRC.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry?
No, thank you very much, because now we need to conclude.
Oh,
before we go, maybe this is very long topic. Maybe we need more than time. But I need to have Martin one question. Now you have as pay as you go. What's the government or the public sector need to support you in that one?
There is a lot of collaboration that is needed between private sector and the public sector. and it has been mentioned here in passing that government will play a very key role in ensuring there is regulatory support. We are talking about removal of some tariffs on the clean cooking accessories. We are talking about subsidies where necessary. We are talking about an enabling incentivizing environment that will encourage private sector to come in and invest, so that when you're coming in and putting your money in the long term, you can see the benefit. Because like I said, to move households from dirty fuels to clean cooking requires a huge capital outlay. That's not a big deal if you can see the future. And if you can be able then to marshal all the fundings that we have been talking about, you are able to enter without having that fear or risk, and therefore we can together achieve a huge impact in this big topic of clean cooking in the continent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, is the time, it is very challenging to cover this very complicated issue in Africa. But what I can take it from here, first of all, we need to have a collaboration. We need to work together, as Dr. Richard said. We need to as the public sector, to play its role to facilitate the policy, and also to facilitate local manufacturing. I think we need to have a carbon credit as the key, of course, among others. And I think by this, I can conclude this session. It is very challenging to discuss this topic in 25 minutes. But I think we get the general sense of what's the solution and what the way we all should go. And allow me, or I request the audience to give a round of applause for my panelists. And I think I can conclude the session here. Thank you very much. And yeah.
Many thanks. Merci beaucoup pour ce panel des plus enrichissants. C'est vrai que les panels se suivent mais ne se ressemblent pas. Et je vois d'ailleurs à votre attention que vous êtes très intéressés par ce qui est dit et qu'il y a effectivement matière à réflexion. Alors, pour parler de garanties pour la réduction des risques, nous avons le plaisir, une fois de plus, d'accueillir des experts de premier plan. De toutes les façons, nous n'en avons que ça, des experts de premier plan, qui partageront avec nous leurs perspectives et leurs expertises sur ce sujet crucial. Nous accueillons donc Ethiopis Tafara. Il est vice-président et directeur des finances, des risques et de la légalité, de la durabilité au sein du groupe de la Banque mondiale. Il modérera cette session. Il est en train de monter, accompagné de deux éminents intervenants, Constanzi, directeur général adjoint et responsable des risques au sein du Africa Guarantee Fund, et également Chinua Azubike, directeur général d'Infracrédit. Mesdames et messieurs, vous êtes attendus sur scène pour le prochain panel. Merci beaucoup.
Bridging the risk divide, scaling private investment with enhanced de-risking solutions. I'm Ethiopis Tafara, MEGA Vice President, responsible for finance, risk, legal, and sustainability. I'm pleased to be able to introduce the panelists of today's session. Ms. Rencia von Tonder, Head Renewable Energy, Power and Infrastructure at Standard Bank. Mr. Constant Nzi, who's Deputy Group Chief Executive Officer and Group Chief Risk Officer, African Guarantee Fund. And then we're also joined by Mr. Chinua Azubike, who is CEO of InfraCredit. Private sector participation will be critical to meet the investment needs of Mission 300 in both off-grid and on-grid energy systems. However, scaling private sector investment requires a conducive business climate, as you've heard multiple times today, and increased investor confidence. Through the energy compacts, the governments have signaled their commitment to improving and enabling environment for private sector investment and to take bold steps to build the capacity of the utility and government to put the electricity sector on the pathway to financial sustainability. Over the last year, unprecedented amounts of private capital have been committed to Mission 300, including with strong willingness to support innovative business models in both distributed renewable energy and on-grid space. However, private investors continue to be wary of the range of commercial and non-commercial risks facing energy companies in Africa. So I'm pleased today that this conversation will focus on what guarantee providers can do differently to accelerate private investment in the energy sector. With that, I'm going to turn to the first question that I'm going to address to Mr. Chinua Azubike, the CEO of InfraCredit. And I have a two-part question for you. First, InfraCredit has an impressive record of catalyzing domestic credit from pension funds and from insurance funds into traditional infrastructure projects. How is InfraCredit adapting its approach for DRE, for distributed energy companies? And second, when we're chatting earlier, you mentioned the importance of building an ecosystem to support the efficient financing of distributed energy companies. Tell us more.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. A bit of a context, just in terms of the opportunity we see for domestic financing for DRE and essential infrastructure in Africa. The AFDB estimates that within the assets under management of the pensions, the insurance, and sovereign wealth funds and other asset managers across Africa is estimated at about $2.5 trillion. And this grows as an average rate of between 10 to 15% per annum. Now, the opportunity is mobilizing these domestic resources to finance development. And if you put it within the context of DRE, what InfraCredit has been able to achieve with the support of our development partners is de-risking renewable energy projects to raise long-term finance in local currency from the capital markets and from these class of institutional investors. However, as we think about scale, there are two things we observe. So first is, this is a nascent asset class that requires some level of standardization in terms of how do you ensure the documents, the preparation phase of these projects meet the criteria of lenders. And this is so important that we walk backwards to helping, leveraging the sort of tools and requirements that the credit providers want to enhance the capacity of the developers and the operators of these projects to ensure that they develop projects using the right set of documents. And this will significantly reduce the time cycle it takes to get to financial close. So we estimate that this should be able to reduce the time by over 70% if we standardize documentation. But more importantly is recognizing that these models operate within an ecosystem. And so when we think through the development problem, we need to think about the system that needs to also be enhanced. And this is where we look at the actors that need to coordinate from the early stage financing to long-term finance and bringing in enabling instruments that help to ensure that the de-risking is credit enhancing the project from the business model innovation to long-term access to finance and ultimately accessing capital markets on their own basis. This is the ability to rate these asset classes and enable them to raise financing with less guarantees in the future. And we've seen this happen in Nigeria, where we supported a hydro project in 2019 to issue a 15-year local currency bond. And a year and a half later, because the pension funds were comfortable with the performance, they didn't need a guarantee, and that company was able to finance without a guarantee. So this is really a journey to self-reliance, and we think about it in terms of how do we enhance the ecosystem and how do we ensure that the coordination creates a path to self-sustainability.
Thank you, Chinua. Let us now hear from Mr. Constant Z, who is the Deputy Group Chief Executive Officer at the African Guarantee Fund. Constant, local currency financing is vital to helping distributed energy companies manage foreign exchange risks and to sustainably scale up their business. African Guarantee Fund is a leader in guarantee solutions for financial institutions. How is the Africa Guarantee Fund deploying its guarantees and technical assistance resources to unlock local currency financing?
I will start with the point made by my CEO earlier about the asset available in Africa, because what we are trying to do is to see how we can make all this financing available in Africa to SMEs. So this is the reason why we are talking about de-risking, because today banks have trillions of resources sitting in the balance sheet, and these resources need to be allocated to projects that they think have a lesser risk than another project. So the main goal of African Guarantee Fund is to enhance the credit worthiness of SMEs. So the very first point is how we help banks to take an exposure on SMEs without taking the perceived high risk of the SME. So we provide this credit enhancement to banks to increase their appetite. When we do that, there is a second point coming in the picture, which is the collateral, because even if a project is bankable, a very good risk, it still needs some collateral. And collateral has a cost, because most of the point that banks or end users use to make to the guarantee use is the fees, the cost of the guarantee. But what we need to keep in mind is even when you provide a collateral, this collateral has a cost. If you provide a cash collateral, you have an arbitration between placing this cash collateral in fixed deposits, earning in local currency 4%, 5%, or using it as a collateral. So by having a guarantee which will cost you 1%, 2%, 3%, you are saving this cost of collateral. So this is the second thing that we are providing to make sure that the resources are being routed to the SMEs. And then something very important that, because we are talking about DRE, something very important that needs to be put on the table is the tracking, the accountability of green projects, because DFIs will always push to have some exposure in green fields for SMEs, but what we tend to forget when it comes to SMEs is this KPIs tracking. And the SMEs don't have the know-how to track the KPIs when it comes to green projects. So what AGF is doing differently on this specific challenge is to work on some technical assistance to have an expert, a technical expert outside the PFI and outside the SME to track these indicators and demonstrate that the financing which is being sent to SMEs is really helping to achieve the goal. So this is the main thing that we have been working on internally in terms of technical assistance, which is very important to give a kind of assurance to the GFIs, to all the donors, that your resources that you are routing to the green field is being used properly.
Thank you, Constant. Now I'd like to hear from Rencha Fontonder, who is, as I said, head of renewable energy and power and infrastructure at Standard Bank. Rencha, as Africa's largest bank, Standard Bank is an important leader in financing energy access and the energy transition. What is Standard Bank doing differently to expand financing, and what would you like to see more of from guarantee providers?
Thanks. Sorry, it seems like. Can you hear me now? Perfect. So, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. I think it's an important question, and maybe just for clarity, many of you may not know Standard Bank per se, but we also operate in some countries as Stanbic Bank, like in Tanzania. So for us, it's more about a partnership opportunity. Our clients range from smaller scale clients in the SME sector up to large scale projects. And we focus mostly at the moment in Africa around energy access, linking that into larger scale projects. When we look at the different type of opportunities, and this is where commercial banks are to a certain extent critical, but also important to partner with DFIs and guarantee providers. I believe that you can leverage what we can do as a commercial bank 3, 4, 5 times if you find the right balance in terms of the type of guarantees and the need that is out there. We look at, for example, when you look at solar home systems versus mini-grids versus IPPs selling into utilities versus what we see now being developed in the continent, traders, aggregation, the need for the type of finance and the risk allocation very different. So, for example, when you look at the solar home system, we've done some of these portfolio plays, specifically in Kenya, and our role was very limited to local currency finance in country through the balance sheet that we do have available, supporting the DFIs at that point in time. However, it hasn't been that significant in terms of scaling up the rollout and financing of that play. And I think that's where we need to work smartly. When you look at mini-grids, we haven't done much. And I think part of the challenge really is around how do you address payment risk? How do you address the ability where you don't have a cornerstone off-taker and find that commercial bankability around that? I don't want to discuss too much around IPPs because I think the ones that has been very successful, there has been really good support from the risk providers and guarantee partnerships between banks like ourselves. And I think what we need to do there is probably find that balance between how do we get more bankable projects into that pipeline, because there's so many opportunities. We find that sometimes it's a stop-start and you end up trying to address a risk that a developer or a sponsor should take that a commercial bank shouldn't take. The one part that I do see where we see more and more development, and maybe it's as we see a liberalized market being adopted through an open market system in the markets we operate with, South Africa, Namibia, Zambia and Kenya being the leaders, is where we introduce traders. And I think a good example is how do we find the right risk allocation and be able to fund that with the right partners. We've recently closed a transaction in Zambia with Africa Green Co, and we didn't have any risk mitigation in terms of a guarantee structure, but we had the ability to finance that to be able to fast track the business case around something like a trader. What we've also done, and we're busy with some of those transactions in South Africa, is where we have the introduction of traders, and the need is very different. You need a first loss, you need a liquidity buffer, you need risk mitigation through a whole different range of risk parameters. And I think what I would like to see more of is closer alignment in terms of those specific needs and how do we address those risks.
Thank you, Rensha. And I have to say, the insights you're sharing of the role that guarantees play in mobilizing private investment resonate with me from a MIGA perspective. You may know, and many of you may know, that President Banga called for the creation of a World Bank Group platform that brings together all of the guarantee products and guarantee experts within the World Bank Group under one umbrella. The purpose of which was 2 or 3-fold. One, just to make it simpler to navigate the system, the World Bank Group system, so you had one-stop shop for all guarantees. You would know where to go and you would be coming to MIGA. But also to streamline the execution and diligence process, and to make it more or less uniform across the World Bank Group, irrespective of whether or not it's a bank guarantee, an IFC guarantee, or a MIGA guarantee, the three institutions that fall under the MIGA umbrella. But for me, I think the most important aspect of this guarantee platform is our ability now to bring various guarantee products together, right? So we've done it in the past, it was much more ad hoc, but now we can bring our non-commercial risk guarantees together with credit risk guarantees in support of a project and do that systematically. And I think what we'll find is that we're able to grow the pie of projects that we do by virtue of that combination. But also bringing the experts under one roof allows us to start thinking about innovation, right? So we're now in the throes of thinking through providing a portfolio cover. You know, many of you know that MIGA historically provides its cover on a project-by-project basis, and we've been very good at that and very successful at that. We've had a number of investors come to say to us, listen, I have a portfolio of projects. Can you provide a cover for that entire portfolio? And if you do, that will help me do more. So we're thinking, you know, do we know how to identify the risk, manage that risk, price that risk, and we think we will be able to do that in relatively short order. And then, of course, we're also thinking about the application of liquidity solutions and payment guarantees and approaches to mitigate what we've seen in many projects, which is the regulatory uncertainty what that results in terms of liquidity. And then we have the benefit of blending. We have the IDA PSW, so the private sector window under IDA, which we use to actually manage the cost of our guarantees. But we also have a couple of trust funds, one supported by the Japanese and Norwegians for renewable energy that we use to actually bring down the price of our guarantees. And then finally, we also have a trust fund to help with the technical assistance around much of what needs to be managed in a project around environmental and social issues and integrity issues. Before we wrap up here, I wanted to do one more round of questions to hear from each of you what you think the biggest challenge is in scaling financing towards energy access and how you plan to address that challenge from your perspective. And maybe this time around we'll go in the other order and we'll start with you, Rencha.
Thanks. I think it has been said quite a lot today, and I want to emphasize it again. If we got clear policies accepted and adopted with a commitment from governments to be able to fast-track that and execute, we will have more bankable projects and more appetite to fund. And I think we as lenders are certainly key to be able to address that, and we're keen to do that.
Thank you. Chinua?
Yeah, so, you know, when we take an asset class like the DRE, which is estimated to be a pathway to electrifying most Africans that are unserved today, what we find is that we need to understand bankability from resource standpoint in terms of, you know, working backwards to understanding what lenders want, but also knowledge exchange and building capacity to ensure that those are built, integrated into as tools into how projects are prepared. I think that knowledge exchange can be replicated and expanded, so you don't have to essentially go through the same whole cycle that it will take. For example, in Nigeria, if we've proven that you could standardize through these models and enable aggregation and scale. And this is what we're doing, you know, at InfraCredit, sort of using these tools to develop standards and processes that can help the development cycle of projects to come in a form that lenders are willing to support. And I believe that through this approach, we can leverage the other support system that could come from for the technical assistance or for the form of blending, but that we can replicate these solutions across other markets, because it's really the same pain points that developers are struggling with across the continent when it comes to these business model and asset class.
Thank you, Chinua. Constance, you get the last word.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So for me, the main challenge is what you rightly describe within the bank. because you mentioned that within the bank, what you have been trying to do is to put everything on the same platform and make sure that it is deployed on an optimal manner. So this is a work you have been doing very well within the bank. But from where we are sitting as another player, we think that if we want to be optimal or efficient in deploying these resources to the private sector, we need to have this one team, not within the World Bank or the African Development Bank, but across all players. Make sure that if there is one solution which is already being deployed by one player, this player has to deploy this solution and not start having many players deploying the same solution. We talk about guarantee. We have to identify which is the proper guarantee fund in this sector to deploy this activity. We are talking about technical assistance. We need to find the right player to deploy the technical assistance and so on. And by doing that, we know that we are talking with one voice and will be more optimal to deploy the resources.
Thank you, Constance. So for me, 2 or 3 takeaways from this conversation. One around project preparation and the role that standardization of documents can play when it comes to facilitating project preparation and bankability of projects. Also, another takeaway is the role that guarantees can play in what I call the demonstration effect. So, you support a project with a guarantee, and if that project proves to be successful, it may make the guarantee unnecessary in the future. Indeed, I expect it would. And you have players that are then able to access the markets, capital markets, more easily, having demonstrated by virtue of the support we provided them with a guarantee that they're worth the bet. Another takeaway on guarantees as a complement to what I will call asset-based lending, based on what you were saying, Constant, right? Where collateral tends to play a big role in the decisions that banks make and whether or not to lend. With a guarantee, you might be able to actually compensate for the inability to provide collateral, and again, use that as a means of doing lending slightly differently than has been traditionally the case. My final takeaway is the importance of collaboration. We've had a conversation in the back, and you've heard it here. We think it's very important that we grow the pie of development projects and not compete with one another over the existing pie of projects, right? And as Constant was saying, and I think my other colleagues were saying, figuring out what the right division of labor is amongst us, right? Who's best placed to take on a particular aspect of a project, and have that entity, organization, take on that role and find a complementary role to play. I think collaboration is going to be far better for growing the pie of development projects as opposed to competition. But with that, if you could give a round of applause to our panelists. And I think we've gained 5 minutes of time. So with that, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can do a better round of applause. I know it is late in the afternoon, but that was a riveting conversation. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I do see that there is a request for a photo. I think that photo has been taken. All is well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. We have just one final rapid panel discussion that is left to go on our program, after which we are going to hear some closing comments from Dr. Kafulila, who of course is the Executive Director for Public-Private Partnerships in the Ministry of Finance here in Tanzania. But before we get there, the final conversation is set to really then zoom in on private sector participation in transmission. Now, I want to do a quick check in the room to see if my panelists are with me. The moderator of the session is Mutale Mukuka. Mr. Mutale Mukuka, let me have are you in the room with us? Thank you very much. He's here. He is the CFO, rather, of the Copperbelt Energy Corporation, CEC. Joining him on stage is Chris Flavin, the acting CEO of Gridworks. Chris, thank you so much for being here. And closing up the panel is John Mativo. John, welcome. and John is the Managing Director and CEO of KETRACO. So I have two gentlemen on stage, and I believe that our third gentleman will be joining us shortly. And he'll be joining us on stage. Thank you very much. So we're all complete. Mr. Mukuka, I'm going to hand over the floor to you. You have the hardest job today with the final panel of the afternoon, but I don't doubt that it's going to be a robust conversation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I guess it's evening now. Good evening, everyone. So,
good evening.
We've got an easy one here. I've got experts to help unpack the topic that we have. I think half the time in the sector, we have a small subsector, which is the transmission segment, which is highly neglected from an investment perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and more often than not, we see that this subsector is often seen to be a public sector-led type investments in there. However, over the last couple of years, a number of initiatives have allowed this subsector to change or transform in its own. So what you see is that whether you're looking at it from a west, east, or SAP perspective, you see that there are regional groupings that are coming up with utilities forming their associations, and that in itself is putting pressure on integration of transmission grids of the respective countries. The second issue is that there is a push for the integration of intermittent supply, which is the renewables, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, and so on. Now, that in itself, again, from a technical perspective, investment perspective, requires a different form of and aggressive investment. But coupled with that, we see a couple of challenges. One of the challenges is that this sector is seen to be public-driven, and therefore, half the time, ourselves, the consumers, see this as a public good, and therefore do not want to pay a commensurate tariff that is there. We also have, in the respective countries, we have currency mismatch with the borrowing currencies that are there. But we also have not seen a lot of private sector injection of financing. Now, with a target of 300 million people that we need to connect, it means that we need to allow for private sector financing to come in and essentially go alongside the public financing that is there to activate some of these interconnections that are there, with the regional interconnection, as well as the new build. And to have this conversation, I've got Chris and John, who are experts in this field. Chris is the CEO of GridWorks. I've got John. John is the CEO of KETRACO. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Mitali. Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Okay. Sure. So the first question, maybe I'll push it to John. John, what is the role of the private sector in transmission? Do you see the private sector having more of a role now that we need to spend so much money in transmission, in infrastructure, and how do you see it playing out? How can they participate?
Thank you for that. First, let me appreciate the host, Tanzania, for this opportunity, and specifically I want to speak to those my brothers and sisters in TANESCO. In December, we energized the Kenya-Tanzania interconnectors, so Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania are connected, actually the same harmonized frequency, so we are interconnected, so that's something to celebrate. But back to your question, mission 300 million, it's a big one. What is the space there? I was just doing quick mathematics, breaking down the work there, then I'll come back to Kenya in terms of opportunities. Basically, the world has 8 billion people, 7 million kilometers of transmission line, 110 kilometers of distribution lines. Use the same ratio with Africa expecting to connect 300 million people. you're basically talking about close to 4 million kilometers of distribution lines that need to be put in place and almost 250,000 kilometers of transmission. So there's a lot of work to be done. But even if you assume that half the people will be served either using solar isolated off-grid solutions, or if it's densification of existing transformers, you're basically talking about anything close to 2 million kilometers of distribution and anything like 150 kilometers of transmission. Now, looking at those numbers, for those of us who don't know the number of transmission lines in sub-Saharan Africa, that's close to what we have. So there's a lot of work to be done to get the infrastructure needs to meet this target, and you only have, let me say, 6 years to meet the targets. So let me look at KETRACO's perspective, and I believe most African countries, as the moderator said, transmission infrastructure has been basically the national government borrowing from development partners, then on granting the money to the utility company like KETRACO. We build, the government uses its own resources, taxes, to pay for what is borrowed. Then maybe we get a tariff on operation maintenance. But we have actually seen as KETRACO, if you look at the volume of work that is on top of, in front of me, especially as MD, that model cannot continue to be sustainable. I cannot continue doing all projects through government borrowing only and on granting myself. And that's why we've opened up the space for PPP. KETRACO assumes anything close to 10-15% of our projects, when we do our cost-benefit analysis, can safely be done by private sector, being able to bring projects that can actually bring benefits that can be accrued at the public in the end, whether there is a tariff increase. But when we look at it in terms of reduction in terms of losses or increasing of consumption, which goes back to increasing sales, there's a benefit at the end. So that's the direction we're going. Private sector coming on board. In Kenya, I believe for Africa to meet these targets, there's no way the model of government borrowing can work alone. It has to be a joint partnership with the private sector. Thank you, moderator.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, John. Coming to you, Chris, you are playing in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. I guess you've seen that some countries have made reforms. Some countries are better today than others. Some regional associations are better than others. Could you just give us some insight as to what you're seeing on the continent? Which countries and which regions are favored today based on where they are? What would you want to see different in those countries that are lagging behind in terms of investment in transmission?
Sure. So, look, first of all, I want to say that I think it's possible to do private sector transmission projects in most countries on the continent. I think there's often a lot of discussion about creating enabling environments and creating transmission regulations and so on and so forth. And this is very important work, but most countries on the continent have an Electricity Act and or a PPP Act that are at least permissive of private sector investment. So this can work most places, particularly most countries that have already used private capital in the generation sector, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We have bankable structures, implementation agreements, government support arrangements that work for the generation sector that can also be used for the transmission sector. Now that said, there are clearly countries that have made more progress in this area in the last 4 or 5 years, which is the period of time in which GridWorks has been established. When GridWorks was established in 2019, there were, I think, probably only a couple of countries, maybe 2 or 3 on the continent, who had made a sort of a public policy decision to use private sector capital in the mix to fund transmission. One of them was Uganda, where we're in the process of having a transmission project licensed at the moment at GridWorks. Another was Kenya, where John has been working with the private sector on some projects there which will serve as pilots. We're also seeing some material developments in the SAP region at the moment. GridWorks is working on the CHUMA project, which is just under 500 kilometers of 400 kV line and associated substations. This is a very material, privately financed project that will reinforce the connection between the central grid in Mozambique and the north. And, I mean, Mutali, the market that you are focused on, Zambia, is a very dynamic market at the moment. There's a lot going on there. And clearly South Africa is planning a programmatic approach to transmission as well, and will try and replicate the benefits of the REAP process there for renewables in the transmission space. So we are seeing a lot of countries really focusing on this. Morocco deserves a mention as well. There's a large HVDC project under development there. And there's a growing trend because, as John said, governments can't continue to carry the cost of developing this sector on their balance sheets. It's a very material cost, and there isn't sufficient headroom to do this any other way. So, look, it's a very dynamic market at the moment, and we think this is going to be a very material growth area. It's certainly something that GridWorks is focusing on at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. I guess going back to you, John, looking at it from a government and utilities perspective, what do you see as being the sort of opportunities and benefits of them introducing private sector financing in the respective countries to fund the transmission infrastructure?
I guess one of the benefits that we just ran with is maybe two main benefits because of time. One of them is definitely the ability for government to run everything else at balance sheet, which I've said. This helps me to meet our targets in terms of transmission master plan, meet all the targets that we're coming to. But I wanted to stress more in terms of the efficiency that private sector needs to bring on board and should be bring on board based on the PPP Act. So basically, whether it's time efficiency, technology efficiency, to be able to ensure that projects, and again, ensure these projects accrue benefits that can actually be felt by the public faster than it should be. Let me give a good example, whether we talk about the Kenya-Ethiopia line, which, because of various reasons, especially government financing, we finish anything between 4 and 5 years later than expected, than what was the initial EPC timeline. Thinking about if we had private sector who could have taken the project, and you see how much savings Kenya is getting in terms of, because of buying cheaper power from Ethiopia, we are making actually cost of power in Kenya is cheaper because of that additional benefit that comes into that. So efficiency from private sector, and I'll just pick one example, finishing projects on time. They're supposed to, otherwise they don't get paid for it because it's performance-based payment is one of the best benefits that comes to the whole thing. So helps the government make quick decisions, helps me meet my targets, and again, the efficiency that comes on board. So briefly, I'll say that.
Thank you. So, Chris, I guess coming back to you, if we look at the landscape, right, one of the key issues is what sort of models can be used by the private sector to invest their capital in ITP. Now, what do you see as the key challenges as it relates to regulation and some of the financing sort of risks that you see, whether it's the cost of capital, the structuring, the risk allocation, and how can we overcome those based on the models that you've seen operating on the continent?
So I'll go back to how I started my previous answer, that a lot of the thinking on this can be replicated from the IPP sector if we are moving ahead with sort of narrow PPPs, ITPs, IPTs, whatever you want to call them. You have a simple offtake agreement with the utility, and you have some government support arrangements. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel with this. There are risk mitigation tools available already for other forms of infrastructure in Africa, including liquidity support instruments from people like ATIDI, political risk insurance. I see the MEGA team sitting in the room. We've got standard practice in all of these markets on government support arrangements. So the experience of GridWorks so far has been that when we get projects towards financial close, there is no lack of capital that's very interested in financing them. We have long-term debt and long-term equity available for infrastructure projects in Africa. The gap that we see is at the front end. It's project development. It's risk capital to develop projects. Transmission is very capital intensive, but developing transmission projects is very expensive as well. Projects, sort of, $300 or $400 million projects cost $10 to $15 million to develop, and there isn't a lot of suitable funding available to cover that. A lot of the sort of development facilities that are available for the African energy sector at the moment were designed around sort of smaller scale renewables projects. so that they don't really fit larger projects like this. So I think that's the key area, and that's where the development finance community, I think, could focus more resources to unlock more of these projects.
Thank you. I guess we have a few minutes to go. Maybe we can have one question each. And coming back to you, John, maybe you might want to just give a highlight of how we can enhance collaboration between the private sector and public sector. You know, what are the three things that should be taken into account to build stronger partnership between the governments, the utilities, the regulators, and the private sector who are injecting capital in these projects?
Thank you. I think once a country has developed the right PPP framework, especially regulations and the Act and all guidelines that are there, then whether it's the Energy Act, for example, in Kenya, but I believe in other places, has a framework in terms of onboarding private sector players to come on board. So the Act, the laws are very clear in terms of how private player comes on board. I think the next thing is to focus in terms of how do we get especially the government side, to have the capacities and the skills that are necessary. And here people have to work together. The other one is to develop documents, because one of the things right now, preparing project agreement with Africa 50, and it's taken longer to develop the whole thing. And if there's a way to have standardized documents, will make things much faster to move forward. Then the whole issue in terms of being able to, because the biggest risk in terms of transmission line, one of them is definitely the issue of right of way, the way leaves. If we can find a solution in terms of how they can be got early and acquired, even if it's going to be paid through the project later, but at least that ensures that is taken care of. Issues of liquidated payments, liquidated support to ensure there is in the utility companies that especially are collecting money from the consumers, they have enough resources to be able to pay. I know that's one of the debates. I know there is a TD and MEGA we talked about. I think we are still debating in terms of how to have either 2 months worth of payment available, some cash support. So basically seen in terms of how government, private sector and development partners can come and ensure that at least the first set of PPP projects in Africa transmission lines will be made easier to develop as we go forward. Then the other thing is definitely how do we communicate this information to the public? That they're critical factors. If it's not well handled, this is something that Africa, most people are still have not absorbed what a private sector player will be doing in transmission infrastructure. So that's something that we can work on, I believe, all of us together, and make it much easier to implement future projects. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick one for you, Chris. Innovation is a key word in anything. How can we be innovative? How can we think outside the box from a financing perspective? And what financial instruments are out there for the investors who are here? What should they look at? Should they just limit themselves to the traditional financing that we see? Or are there other instruments that they should be looking at to finance transmission infrastructure? Under 1.5 minutes.
1.5 minutes. I'll try and be very quick. I'm not sure if this is innovation, because it's probably going back to the tried and tested from other markets. In most places in the world where major grid extensions, major grid projects have happened, in places that have close to 100% access now in Europe and North America, a lot of the heavy lifting was done by governments, and then a lot of the time by PPPs, so governments in coordination with the private sector. In Africa at the moment, we seem to be trying these two polar opposite models. You've got the tried and tested public sector financing routes, loans from MDBs, government resources, and then some projects, a small number of projects, they're sort of tossed to the private sector and they say, sort of have at it and see if you can do this without any subsidy. The very obvious way to do this is for the scarce public sector funding that requires government support to be spread around a number of projects to deal with viability gaps in them, and then to leverage private finance, so that if there's $100 million available, $200 million, instead of doing one project of concessionary money, instead of doing one project, you use it to deal with a viability gap on 7 or 8 projects that are then funded with the private sector. I think that's the way to do the big heavy lift on the continent. The trick is going to be how you do this with the appropriate governance and the appropriate process from a procurement perspective when you're using this sort of public funding, because there's a risk that it could take a very long time to do these things programmatically.
Thank you, gentlemen. I guess a quick summary there is that we need the private sector financing in transmission. We need, from a government perspective, to ensure that we put in place the right framework from a regulatory perspective. We need to have the right ahead risk allocation between the investors, the government, and the utilities. There is no way that we are going to achieve the 300 million access to electricity if we do not find a way of attracting private sector financing in transmission as well. More importantly, I think we need to ensure that we have reliable transmission networks that will allow for the supply of reliable and efficient power. But we need to be ready to support the transition, energy transition that is there. With that, Adu, please allow. You can clap for my experts here. I think they've done a good job. We've got John and Chris. This is the last session, I guess. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll invite the. Oh, there you are. Thank you.
Oui, je suis là également pour vous remercier d'avoir partagé vos points de vue durant ce panel. Thank you very much. Il est à présent temps de conclure cette journée. Et pour ce faire, nous avons l'honneur d'accueillir Monsieur David Kafulila, directeur exécutif des partenariats publics-privés au ministère des Finances de la République de Tanzanie. Un grand merci, mesdames et messieurs, effectivement, à nos panélistes et à notre modérateur.
Good evening. Yes, distinguished panelists, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it is my pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to address this very strategic conference after having almost all the sessions for today. Mine is just to summarize and, of course, to put things together according to what we have been discussing, either from the perspective of panelists, but also from the general observation. As an executive director for public-private partnership, I have something to share. First of all, the Mission 300 is not just and it should not be just a goal, but it has to be something to have in action. But again, this kind of ambitious projection of creating access to electricity for more than around 300 million people, it needs very strategic interventions. But from the perspective of panelists, you can all agree that achieving this ambitious goal takes more than government alone to strategize and achieve. So it is from that perspective that the panelists who have been discussing issues around power transmission line by using private sector have concluded that it is inevitable. I mean, private sector engagement is inevitable, that we must engage private sector to make sure that we achieve this ambitious goal and making this dream sustainable, practical, and achievable. This can be noted from the numbers and the size of our economies as a continent. For instance, to date, according to IMF data, the ratio of debt to GDP for Tanzania is around 47%. For Kenya is around 70%. Rwanda 71%. Malawi is around 84%. The whole continent of Africa is subjected to debt distress. The ratio of the GDP of the whole continent to debt to GDP of the whole continent is around 67%. So this calls for more alternative financing to achieve such strategic projects like power transmission. So, in a nutshell, we need to align almost every stakeholders, every players, in making sure that we mobilize the resources to implement such massive investment in power transmission and, of course, even generation. Because when we are talking access to electricity, we are talking about increasing generation, but also increasing transmission, increasing connectivity. So, in order to achieve this ambitious goal, we need to align with all players. And there are multiple players because there are multiple interventions. I mean, resolving issues around power transmission, generation, involve multiple interventions from generation, from project planning to the project execution, from transmission to generation, generation to transmission. So there are multiple players involved. We need government to align with the private sector interests. We need the government and the private sector to align with the lenders' interests. We need the government, lenders, and private sector to align with the civil society interests, because it is the role of civil society to make sure that the general society in Africa achieve equity and inclusive energy access. So we need connectivity to around 300 million people, but this connectivity must go together with inclusiveness. So we need to make sure that we strategize in a way that all the players, from financials, civil society, private sector, all are aligned to make sure that we achieve this ambitious goal. Because one of the critical challenges that we are facing is misalignment among the key players. So in doing so, we need to undertake some major reforms in making sure that the policy and legal and regulatory frameworks are in line with the interest of those key and major players. In Tanzania, for instance, we amended our law, the PPP Act, in 2023. And the Act now is providing some key elements to make sure that we have the framework which is competitive, to make sure that no investor can fail to decide investing simply because of the weakness in our framework. Our framework provides government guarantees. Our framework provides viability gap funding, that in case maybe the project is not commercially viable but economically is viable, the law provides viability gap funding to support investors. But the law provides room for international arbitrations, which was not there before the amendment. And the law provides establishment of special purpose vehicle for the sake of transparency and accountability. So after having done all these amendments in our legal framework, we have seen the mushrooming of investors' interest to invest in our country, especially in this sector. Why? It's because of the friendly and competitive legal and regulatory framework. The only challenge so far, which we are trying to address, and this has been and this is in the desk of TANESCO, is an issue of making alignment between the Energy Act, which limits private sector to undertake transmission. So we hope that soon we'll amend the Act to allow private investor to undertake, to be engaged in power transmission. So, ladies and gentlemen, this ambition of 300 million people connected by 2030, it should be not, we must make it not a goal to achieve in 5 years, but we have to put action plan in place to make sure that we achieve systematically, step by step, and each country is assessed according to what we have agreed. Maybe by making this one, we can achieve this ambitious goal in a holistic manner. Because some countries might achieve, while some countries might left behind, which is not the case, which is not the target of this conference. The purpose of this conference is to make sure that as a continent, we grow together. As a continent, we achieve this ambitious goal together. It is practical, it is possible, but it needs strategies, it needs establishment of mechanism to make sure that we get it done in a framework, in the time provided, which is 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear panelists, the way forward is so clear that we need to harmonize the efforts. By harmonization of efforts, it means to harmonize efforts of all actors, all players. We have to harmonize the efforts of lenders, private company, government institutions, utility institutions, of course, the whole government in general. We have to harmonize the civil society efforts. We have to harmonize all the key players' interests and focus to make sure that we achieve the bankable projects. We achieve the projects which can make this continent achieving what we have decided by 2030, which is connecting around 300 million people by 2030. But again, we need to mobilize catalytic funding, because one of the challenges we are facing as a continent is project preparation. But through catalytic fund, we can access funds for project preparations. In PPP, for instance, it is estimated that the project cost around 2% of the, preparation cost around 3 to 5% of the project cost. So this means if you are targeting to mobilize, for instance, $9 billion PPP projects like what we are planning as a nation, as Tanzania, it means you need more than 480 million in 5 years to attain such ambitious goal. So given the pressure in our balance sheet in so many countries, as I've just mentioned for few, on the ratio of debt to GDP, given the ratio of debt to GDP as a continent which is at more than 67%, it means we need some interventions, especially by achieving funds from either blended financing model or institutional investors or any kind of catalytic funds to make sure that we achieve this strategic goal. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my hope that your stay from the morning to this evening has made a great change in your mind. You are not the way you entered during the morning. Thank you and have a good evening.
A very big thank you to Mr. David Kafulila as he gives us his closing remarks and reminds us that the way forward is so clear. thank you for the reminder that it is going to take coordination and harmonization, strategies, and more importantly, sir, it's going to take action. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we close, allow me just to make a few logistical announcements in relation to our dinner plans this evening. We are going to be invited, and we are all invited to the reception, which starts at 1900 hours. The reception is taking place at the exact same place where we had lunch earlier on today, and that starts from 1900 hours. And then, more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, the starting time for tomorrow. Now, remembering that tomorrow we have our heads of state in presence, and as a result, access and security is going to be a lot tighter and a lot more robust. And so we're inviting all our delegates to, firstly, make sure that you are seated by 8 a.m. at the very latest. We will be serving coffee and enabling networking from as early as 6:30. So you can come from as early as 6:30, but by 8 a.m. we request that everybody is seated so that we might receive our heads of state. Anybody who tries to access this venue after 8 will unfortunately not make it in. And so we want to make sure that everybody gets this message so that they can be a part of our conversations tomorrow. The final thing that I'm going to say before I hand over to Marie-Angèle, where she's going to give us a little flyover over the program tomorrow, is to thank you very much for those who are in the room. Thank you for staying in the room throughout the day, but also for everybody who's joining us online. Thank you for remaining connected with us and being a part of our conversation. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it's been an absolute privilege. Marie-Angèle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nozipho. Alors, mesdames et messieurs, effectivement, comme Nozipho l'a précisé, moi je vais vous faire un avant-goût de la journée de demain. Ça sera une journée décisive pour ce sommet sur l'énergie en Afrique. Nous débuterons, comme elle l'a rappelé, par une cérémonie d'ouverture officielle suivie d'interventions de haut niveau de chefs d'État qui seront présents, une vingtaine à peu près, et de leaders internationaux qui partageront leur vision pour l'avenir énergétique du continent africain. Il y aura des panels clés qui aborderont des thèmes essentiels et les chefs d'État présenteront également leurs engagements, parce qu'il y en aura, pour garantir l'accès universel à l'électricité. Alors, la journée sera également marquée par la signature de la déclaration de Dar es Salaam sur l'énergie et enfin, nous conclurons avec des partenariats renforcés et une feuille de route plus claire pour transformer ces ambitions en résultats concrets. Préparez-vous à une journée riche en échanges et en décisions impactantes. Merci à tous une fois de plus pour votre attention, pour votre présence et rendez-vous demain avec tout l'enthousiasme que vous avez eu aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup et je suis sûre que vous êtes très enthousiastes de participer au dîner ce soir. Alors à demain. Merci encore.
Technology ndio mtoa huduma wa mauzo katika ofisi hii hapa. Tupo Ubungo mawasiliano, stendi ya daladala. Karibuni dukani kwetu, tuna kompyuta mbalimbali, tuna kompyuta za maofisini, za wale wanafunzi, PC za bei ya chini kabisa, mfano kama hii hapa ni Lenovo, inaitwa Lenovo E100. Kompyuta hii ina RAM 4, inatumia SSD ya 128, iko very simple, inabebeka. Kwa wale wadada unaweza kuweka kwenye mkoba. Ni nzuri, ni simple sana, ina rangi nzuri. Hata kwa maofisini pia, kwa wale ambao hawana mambo mengi, inawatosha sana. Inapatikana hapa Unicenter kwa bei ya shilingi 330,000 ikiambatana na ofa zake. Pia tuna HP ya bei ya chini hapa, ni X360, inakuwa na RAM 8, SSD 128. Kompyuta za aina zote zenye size tofauti tofauti, kama unavyoona kuna hii inch 17 pia ni generation. Kuna hizi HP zina logo mpya unapata kwa bei ya 7,500 ni generation ya 8. Karibuni pia kuna hizi pia HP kwa wale ambao wanapenda PC zenye slot 2. Hapo unaweza kaweka SSD pamoja na hard disk ukaongeza storage yako katika kompyuta. Ukinunua kompyuta kwetu utajipatia ofa mbalimbali. Kuna bag, utajipatia mouse, utajipatia flash pamoja na mousepad. Karibuni sana, tunapatikana Ubungo mawasiliano, stendi ya daladala, tunaelekeana directly na mlango wa kuingilia daladala.
Yes bana, nahisi utakoshamuelewa vizuri sana dada Fatuma kwa maelezo yake kwamba wewe kwanza lazima ushauriwe laptop gani uichukue kutokana na matumizi yako na usiweze kupigwa zaidi. So kuna wengine hapo mwanzo nilisema kuna wengine wananunua laptop yenye uwezo mkubwa wakati hakustahili kununua laptop yenye uwezo huo kutokana na matumizi yake. Let's say kuna mtu yuko ofisini anasoma emails, anajibu emails, anaandika barua za request mbalimbali kwa service ya internet, mtu anatafuta laptop ya pesa nyingi sana wakati kumbe hiyo pesa ongeza kuitumia kwenye mambo mengine. Au let's say mtu anafanya learning the program kubwa, au let's say mtu anafanya graphics, anaenda kununua laptop kutokana tu kaona bei ndogo, lakini kumbe kanunua laptop ambayo ina uwezo mdogo akashindwa kulani program zake kwa sababu program ni kubwa kuliko uwezo wa kompyuta. So cha msingi kwanza hapa Unicenter Technology unashauriwa kutokana na matumizi yako, then unaelekezwa laptop gani itakufaa kutokana na matumizi yako na kwa kiasi gani. Sinajua tukoshampata dada Fatuma hapo, so kwa maelezo zaidi unaweza kutupigia kwa namba 0718 503350. Lakini pia hii namba unaweza kuikuta kwenye maelezo chini hapo, lakini pia tunakuwekea kwenye screen hapo. Make sure unapiga hiyo namba, tutakuhudumia muda wote unapiga simu. Make sure ukipiga simu uwe una uhakika kwamba unahitaji kujua na kuchukua laptop. Sisi Soma Tapeli ni watu ambao tumenyooka, na ndio maana siku zote lazima tuwalete hii michongo. Bwana, ulikuwa nami ni John wa Michongo. Nikutakie utazamaji mwema wa vipindi vingine. Bye bye.
Bana, kwa majina naitwa Lugenza Peter, ni mhudumu hapa Unicenter Technology. Hiyo Unicenter Technology ni wauzaji wa kompyuta, tuko Ubungo mawasiliano opposite na gate la kuingilia stendi ya daladala. Ukifika hapo stendi ya daladala, ukiangalia mbele yako unaona bango kubwa limeandikwa Unicenter Technology. Tuko na mtumishi fast food, tumezoea kumtambua kwa jina hilo. I say leo iwe bahati kwako kwa wewe uliyebahatika kuona video hii. Sisi Unicenter Technology hatujivunii tu kuuza kompyuta, bali tunajivunia kwa mambo mengi. Hasa pale tunapokutana na feedback kutoka kwa mteja kwamba tumempa kompyuta ambayo inafanya kazi zile ambazo alizokuwa ametarajia. Hivyo ukifika Unicenter Technology tunakuomba na tunakuhitaji utuambie ni kompyuta gani unahitaji kwa ajili ya matumizi gani. Kuna matumizi mengi watu wanaohitaji kompyuta. Kuna wale wa maofisini, kuna wale wa chuoni, na kuna wale watu ambao hawatumii tofauti na hao wenyewe wanataka labda kompyuta kwa kuangalizia movie. Kwa hawa wote tunawashauri according. Watu wa chuoni ni kweli wako aina tofauti. Kuna watu wanaotaka kompyuta heavy duty task na kompyuta za kawaida. Heavy duty task kompyuta ni zile kompyuta ambazo zinatumiwa na watu wa, kwa mfano maengineer, wanahitaji kwa ajili ya ku execute AutoCAD, kuna ArchiCAD, zote zinahitaji kompyuta zenye graphics card kubwa. Umeona? Kwa hiyo tukija kwa upande wa pili, wanafunzi wale wa kawaida wanahitaji kompyuta kwa ajili ya kusomea, kutype na internet. Internet ni muhimu, type ni muhimu, na kusomea ni muhimu. Kwa wote tunawapa kompyuta kutokana na mahitaji yao. Mtu aweze akawa anahitaji kompyuta kubwa na kati anatumia matumizi madogo, tutakushauri bwana, kwa nini uingie gharama ya kununua kompyuta kubwa na kati kuna kompyuta ndogo unaweza kuitumia kwa kazi zako za kila siku. Kwa hiyo tunahitaji kutoa hii elimu kwa watu wote. Kabla hujanunua kompyuta, hata kama utanunua kwetu, basi karibia tu Unicenter Technology uje upate elimu ni kompyuta gani itakao kufaa, and then kama utataka kwenda kununua sehemu nyingine tofauti, sisi we are good on that na tutakuachia free uende. Karibuni sana Unicenter Technology. Kwa mara nyingine tena tunataka kuambia kuhusu kompyuta, matumizi ya kompyuta, jinsi ya kuihandle kompyuta, ni kwa muda gani unatakiwa uichaji, ni muda gani ambao unatakiwa uiache, uizime kompyuta. Kompyuta huwezi kuitumia muda wote. Hivi vyote tunatakiwa kushauri kutokana na kazi zako. Nichukue fursa hii kuwakaribisha na kuambia kwamba kompyuta zipo za aina zote. Desktop, laptop za aina zote. 360 ikimaanisha zinazokunjika, nikimaanisha touch screen, nikimaanisha ya screen ya kawaida, hizo zote zipo. Kuna zenye uwezo mdogo wa processor, kuna Intel Celeron, kuna Intel Atom, kuna Intel Pentium. Tunakuja kwa i3, kwa i5, kwa i7 na kwa i9 na tupo. Generation, zipo generation nyingi. Kuna generation kuanzia ya 4, ya 5, ya 6, ya 7, ya 8, ya 9, ya 10 mpaka 13. Hizo zote kompyuta zipo. Wale ambao wenye uelewa kuhusu processor, mnatakiwa mlijue pia processor inapokuwa kwenye generation ya nyuma unaweza kuikuta ipo kubwa. Yaani generation ya 4 processor ukaikuta ina 2.8 au 3.3. Lakini ikishakuwa generation ya 13 au generation kuanzia ya 6 kwenda juu, processor unaweza kuikuta iko 1.3 au 1.2 au 1.1. Wengi wanasema hii ina processor ndogo, mimi siitaki. Sasa hili ni tatizo. Unatakiwa ujue kwa nini generation kubwa ina processor ndogo. Haya yote ni elimu ambayo unaipata Unicenter Technology. Kwamba processor generation ikiwa kubwa, processor ndogo haimaanishi kwamba ina processor ndogo, bali imeongezwa numbers of cores. Kwa hiyo haya yote unayapata ndani ya Unicenter Technology. Ukinunua kompyuta, cha kwanza unatakiwa uangalie vitu vya msingi ambavyo vitu vya msingi ni kama RAM. Unatakiwa ujue jinsi ya kuangalia RAM. Kuna hard disk au SSD. Kuna wengine wanauziwa kompyuta ya hard disk, anaambiwa ni SSD. Kwa hiyo unatakiwa uvijue hivyo vitu, jinsi ya kuviangalia. Na kama uvijui, Unicenter Technology tunakuelekeza. Ukiwa hapa na ukiuziwa na sisi, tunakufanyia serevu. Sio tu tumekuuzia kompyuta ila ukinunua kompyuta kwetu utakuwa endelea kuwa mteja wetu, utaendelea kuwa mwanafunzi wetu. Kwa kila jambo unakutana nalo ndani ya kompyuta tutakuelekeza na utalitambua, na kuanzia hapo utakuwa umeondoa ujinga katika kulitambua hilo swala. Kwa hiyo service tunayotoa ni endelevu na elimu tunayotoa ni endelevu. Kompyuta ikipata shida, kuna shida zinazotokea ndani ya kompyuta yenyewe na kuna shida zinazosababishwa na watu wa nje. Kwa mfano kompyuta umemwagia maji, ni kweli kompyuta inahitaji maji jamani. Ukimwagia maji kwenye keyboard utaua keyboard. Ukigonga kioo ni kweli kitapasuka, sio kwamba kitapasuka. Hata kama tumekupa warranty, lakini kuna warranty ambazo unatakiwa uziangalie kwamba hivi vitu nimevisababisha mimi au vimesababishwa na kitu kingine ambacho kimetokea. Kwa hiyo unatakiwa mjue jinsi ya kuzichunga kompyuta zenu. Kompyuta unapokuwa unaitumia usiweke juu ya kitanda. Ukiweka juu ya godoro, kwenye kochi, kompyuta haihitaji hivyo vitu. Kompyuta inahitaji kupumua. Same processor ilipo haihitaji kukaa na joto sana. Ndio maana kuna kitu kinaitwa cooling system ndani ya kompyuta. Cooling system ile inahitaji hewa. Ukiweka juu ya godoro, ukiweka juu ya kochi, sehemu ambayo hewa haipiti, ni kweli processor itakufa. Kompyuta ita overheat na itaungua. Kwa hiyo ukirudi na malalamiko hayo kwamba kompyuta yako imeungua, processor nao ni source, unatakiwa uangalie jinsi ya kuichunga. Utakutoa lawama bure, watu wanaouzia ni watu wabovu, wanauzia vitu vibovu, sio kweli. Lakini mnahitajika mpewe elimu. Kwa hiyo haya yote tutakuelezea ukija kuchukua kompyuta kwetu kiunaga ubaga wanasema. Tutakuelezea mwanzo mwisho kwamba tutumia kompyuta namna hii na iweze kukaa namna hii. Nichukue nafasi hii kuwakaribisha sana kwa yote ambaye hajawahi kufika hapa, basi afike hapa. Sisi tutatoa huduma vizuri na tunatumaini kuanzia siku hiyo pia utakuwa ni ambassador wetu, na tunapenda kutengeneza maambassador. Ukinunua kompyuta kwetu uko nako kwenda, ukipata mteja ukimleta kwetu, basi tutaongea vizuri na tutakupatia kuna namna commission utapata. Kwa hiyo umepata nafasi kuona hii video au ulikuja kununua kompyuta kwetu, ukimleta mwenzio tutakufikiria na wewe pia uweze kuendelea kutangaza jina letu.
Ibana niaje ni vipi boy John Peter Laurent aka John Michongo from Tanzania, Dar es Salaam 245 Bongo. Ibana leo kama kaida yako leo nakuletea offers kibao. Najua unazoea siku zote ukiona mic na zimechangamka kama hivi, unajua ni kuna mchongo unakuja ku happen. Ibana 2025 mapema sana Januari nakuletea exclusive mpya. Hizi ni offer mpya, PC mpya, nakuletea brand tofauti kwa bei poa sana. Kuna wale wateja wangu wa mikoani, simu zinaita sana, mnapiga sana simu, na nashukuru mna support. Of course mna support, mizigo inatumwa nini, kuna marafiki wanachukua na bado wanaalika marafiki zao, wana request bidhaa, wanalipia zinatumwa. Lakini pia wa Dar es Salaam pia tunawashukuru, we appreciate your contribution, mnapiga sana simu. Of course tunashukuru, lakini shukrani hizi zinaambatana na offer ambazo tunakuletea leo. Of course offer hizi zinawaendea wale wote ambao wanahitaji PC na laptops kwa matumizi mbalimbali. Kwa mfano kuna wale wafanyakazi ambao wapo maofisini, kuna wale wanafunzi ambao wameshaanza masomo, wengine walianza bila laptop lakini sasa vipindi tayari masomo yashachanganyia, sasa hizi wanahitajika kuwa na laptop. Sasa mimi ndio suluhisho lako. Lakini pia kuna wale watu wa gaming wanapenda kucheza game. Kuna wale ambao wanafanya cryptocurrency, kuna wale wana trade. Watu wa cryptocurrency najua mnafahamu, FX trader wale wanakuwa wanapenda PC ambazo zina touch screen, zinakaa charge muda mrefu. Mtu anaweza kachukua PC yake kaamka kaenda zake sehemu pembeni ya mji, yeye na internet na PC yake haihitaji kuwa na charge, so anahitaji tu PC ambayo inakaa charge muda mrefu. Tuna PC za aina tofauti, tuna HP brand kubwa kabisa, tunazo Dell, tunazo Lenovo, tunazo MacBook, na zote zikiwa na ubora kabisa kuanzia processor mpaka storage ziko fresh kabisa, RAM zikiwa zimenyoka kabisa, na bei zikiwa pia ni nafuu zaidi. Na kizuri zaidi, sisi hatuuzagi vitu ambavyo vinawasumbua wateja, so vitu vyetu vimenyoka siku zote. Bana exclusive hii unaipata kupitia JM Media pekee. Of course ukipiga simu make sure utambue kama ujitambulishe, tangazo miliona kutoka sehemu fulani, ili uweze kupata offer ambazo offer hizi PC inaanzia kuanzia 3,500,000 3,500,000 mpaka 2,000,000. So inategemea hapo kati wewe specification unazotaka kutokana na matumizi yako. Tutakwambia wewe kwa kitu unachokifanya unahitaji PC yenye processor hii, yenye storage hii, yenye RAM hizi, ili uweze kuhandle vile vitu vyako na kulani program zako bila matatizo yote. Of course PC unaweza kupata kuanzia 3,500,000 na ikiwa na offer ya begi, mousepad na ukitaka na flash pia unaweza kupewa. Lakini pia kuna PC za 480,000, 500,000, 5,500,000, 600,000, 700,000, milioni, 2,000,000. Inategemea wewe sasa unahitaji kwa nafasi yako. So cha kufanya ni kupiga simu kwenye nambari ambayo ni 0718 50 3350. Unaweza kunicheki WhatsApp, kunicheki tukafanya business. Mteja ambaye uko mkoani na you don't have a trust kwamba hauamini kama utatumiwa mzigo baada ya kulipia, ni bora tu usitucheki, sababu tuna wateja wengi sana ambao wako serious, wanahitaji service, wanahitaji PC, wanahitaji kulipia watumiwe mzigo. So unakuta tunaelekezana na mteja, unaanza kuchat na mteja kuanzia asubuhi, unamwambia bana location yetu ni Dar es Salaam, hatuna branch anywhere. Lakini condition zetu utalipia PC, utalipia mzigo. Kama ni mkoani, gharama ya kutuma ni yako na gharama yako, ambao kila mkoa tuna organize, huwa cost ni moja tu 20,000 yako, then tunakutumia mzigo. So make sure una understand hivyo vitu kwamba ukihitaji PC make sure kama hauko Dar es Salaam, it means mzigo utaupata kwa kutumiwa, na condition za kutumiwa utalipia mzigo, utalipia PC, then baada ya kulipia utaambatanisha pia na malipo ya usafiri, then mzigo wako utatumwa mzigo wako, yani utakufikia haraka sana na kwa uhakika na kwa uaminifu kabisa. Kama kuna kesi inakuwa umekumbana nayo baada ya kupokea mzigo, unatuconsult, then tunaangalia na kufanya, lakini hatujawahi kulalamikiwa na mteja sisi tuanze kutuma mizigo mikoani. So order ni nyingi mikoani tunatuma. So wewe ambaye huamini kama unaweza kutumia mzigo wako, usitucheki. Ishia tu kupata skills kwamba PC unatakiwa kununua PC kwa kuangalia vitu gani, lakini usitusumbue kutupigia ukiwa hauko tayari kulipia mzigo na kutumiwa. So mimi ni John Peter Laurent, Kijana Michongo, mdhamini mkubwa ni JM Media. So baki na sisi kwa exclusive na bonge moja za offer ambazo kila siku tunakuletea. Bye bye. It's your boy John P. Laurent, Kijana Michongo, 245 Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Bongo TZ. Baki na mimi.
Fatuma Gerard. Napatikana hapa Unicenter Technology, ndio mtoa huduma wa mauzo katika ofisi hii hapa. Tupo Ubungo mawasiliano, stendi ya daladala. Karibuni dukani kwetu, tuna kompyuta mbalimbali. Tuna kompyuta za maofisini, za wale wanafunzi. PC za bei ya chini kabisa. Mfano kama hii hapa ni Lenovo, inaitwa Lenovo E100. Kompyuta hii ina RAM 4, inatumia SSD ya 128. Iko very simple, inabebeka. Kwa wale wadada unaweza kuweka kwenye mkoba. Ni nzuri, ni simple sana, ina rangi nzuri. Hata kwa maofisini pia, kwa wale ambao hawana mambo mengi, inawatosha sana. Inapatikana hapa Unicenter kwa bei ya shilingi 330,000 ikiambatana na ofa zake. Pia tuna HP ya bei ya chini hapa. Ni X360, inakuwa na RAM 8, SSD 128. Kompyuta za aina zote zenye size tofauti tofauti, kama unavyoona kuna hii inch 17, pia ni generation ya 13. Kuna hizi HP zina logo mpya, unapata kwa bei ya 7,500, ni generation ya 8. Karibuni. Pia kuna hizi pia HP kwa wale ambao wanapenda PC zenye slot 2. Hapo unaweza kaweka SSD pamoja na hard disk, ukaongeza storage yako katika kompyuta. Ukinunua kompyuta kwetu utajipatia ofa mbalimbali. Kuna bag, utajipatia mouse, utajipatia flash pamoja na mousepad. Karibuni sana, tunapatikana Ubungo mawasiliano, stendi ya daladala, tunaelekeana directly na mlango wa kuingilia daladala.
Yes bana, nahisi utakoshamuelewa vizuri sana dada Fatuma kwa maelezo yake kwamba wewe kwanza lazima ushauriwe laptop gani uichukue kutokana na matumizi yako na usiweze kupigwa zaidi. So kuna wengine hapo mwanzo nilisema kuna wengine wananunua laptop yenye uwezo mkubwa wakati hakustahili kununua laptop yenye uwezo huo kutokana na matumizi yake. Let's say kuna mtu yuko ofisini anasoma emails, anajibu emails, anaandika barua za request mbalimbali kwa service ya internet. Mtu anatafuta laptop ya pesa nyingi sana wakati kumbe hiyo pesa ongeza kuitumia kwenye mambo mengine. Au let's say mtu anafanya learning the program kubwa, au let's say mtu anafanya graphics, anaenda kununua laptop kutokana tu kaona bei ndogo, lakini kumbe kanunua laptop ambayo ina uwezo mdogo, akashindwa kulani program zake kwa sababu program ni kubwa kuliko uwezo wa kompyuta. So cha msingi kwanza hapa Unicenter Technology unashauriwa kutokana na matumizi yako, then unaelekezwa laptop gani itakufaa kutokana na matumizi yako na kwa kiasi gani. Sinajua tukoshampata dada Fatuma hapo, so kwa maelezo zaidi unaweza kutupigia kwa namba 0718 503350. Lakini pia hii namba unaweza kuikuta kwenye maelezo chini hapo, lakini pia tunakuwekea kwenye screen hapo. Make sure unapiga hiyo namba, tutakuhudumia muda wote unapiga simu. Make sure ukipiga simu uwe una uhakika kwamba unahitaji kujua na kuchukua laptop. Sisi Soma Tapeli ni watu ambao tumenyooka, na ndio maana siku zote lazima tuwaletee hii michongo. Bwana, ulikuwa nami ni John wa Michongo, nikutakie